challenges in terms of the loss of education, and that is why we've done such an extensive £1 billion package to support schools in doing this.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could the Secretary of State guarantee that every child who needs a laptop will have one? But does he also recognise that to create high-quality online lessons takes skill? And so what is he doing to ensure that best practice is spread among all schools before the summer holiday, so that as teachers make their plans, we can know that in September high-quality learning will be available to all?
Well, I can absolutely assure the Honourable Lady that the work and endeavour to ensure that there's high quality teaching and online teaching is there, and we've seen that through the creation of the Oak National Academy. The Honourable Lady may have noticed the announcement just a few days ago about the expansion of that to continue to provide full and total curriculum across all year groups and across every single subject. This is one of a brilliant innovation. I very much encourage the Honourable Lady and her constituents to take advantage of it.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our teachers are critical if we are to look after the next generation and to help us deliver our levelling up agenda. How is the Secretary of State supporting our hard-working supply teachers at this exceptional time? And how is he ensuring that our supply teachers are receiving appropriate remuneration?
Secretary of State.
Well, I know that my honourable friend has raised with me the concern that a number of supply teachers in her constituency of Anglesey has sort of suffered as a result of not being able to access the furlough scheme. I know that in England many agencies have been working closely with the Treasury in order to be able to access the furlough scheme, and I'd encourage the Welsh Government to help support agencies to help their supply staff also to be able to access that as well.
Now go to Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I agree that all who can be at school should be. St Anne's Primary School in Denton was built in 1888. It's a small single-entry school. There are no spare classrooms, and the rooms that they have all open onto the small school hall, which is also used as the dining area. They have a very small outside yard, no playing fields where temporary classrooms can be located, and it's one example of many similar across England. So what assessment has the Secretary of State made of the number of schools which will physically struggle to accommodate all their pupils under the social distancing or educational bubble rules, and how does he plan to help them to be able to educate all children and to do so safely?
Well, when the Honourable Gentleman hopefully has the opportunity to read the guidance, he'll see from the guidance about the importance of having flexibilities for schools, such as the one he outlines, that actually are operating in a very different type of estate that maybe larger schools are able to do so. We've tried to create a clear framework of how we can give schools good advice so they can ensure the education of every single pupil. But if he has any particular issues about any of his schools that he's particularly concerned about, I know that the Minister of State for School Standards would be happy to discuss it with him.
Andy Carter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Schools in my constituency of Warrington South are some of the best in England, and I'm sure I can join with my right honourable friend in paying tribute to the work that heads and teachers and support staff have done over the lockdown period to care and support children. I know parents in my constituency, and in particular children, will really welcome the steps that are being announced today. Children want to get back to school, but can the Secretary of State confirm that his approach is in line with other countries around Europe who've begun to bring preschool children, younger age children back first in a phased way?
Well, he's absolutely right to pay tribute to the teachers and all the staff within the schools and nurseries and colleges within Warrington South, and they've been doing a fantastic job. But the approach that we're taking is very much in line with that of other nations. We all understand that within education settings there are constraints and restrictions that teachers and head teachers have to operate under, and we have to find practical solutions for that. And that is why we've taken a lot of time to look as to how this has been done in other countries and copy the very best practice as a result.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Primary head teachers in my constituency tell me that there are pinch points at the start and end of each school day as children and parents come together. School leaders are planning how they can mitigate this problem, but it may require adaptation. So they're asking, will the Secretary of State set aside funding to ensure that schools can access money to avoid this problem of people coming together?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises an important point in terms of reducing the chances of people meeting together and increasing the likelihood of transmission. That's why we've asked schools to look at the options of staggered starts for year groups so as to mitigate those chances.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Birmingham Northfield has the highest proportion of free school meals of any constituency across the country, and so that's why it's so important that young people are back in school and back in colleges learning again. And so can I ask my right honourable friend that he ensures that as many young people as possible benefit from the COVID-19 catch-up package to ensure that some of our most disadvantaged pupils are given the greatest gift of all, which is a quality education.
Well, I know that my honourable friend in his many conversations with me has been a great champion of his schools and what is happening in his constituency, and he's right about the importance of making sure that this money is properly targeted at the children that most need it. That's why £350 million of that has been ring-fenced for those most disadvantaged, and his constituency will be one of the biggest beneficiaries of that.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the City of Durham constituency, Durham University is a major player and contributes massively to the local economy, to the culture of our city and the communities. So far during this crisis, the lack of government support for universities has been scandalous, quite frankly. Universities, the staff who work for them and the current future students need to know that higher education is valued by this government and will be protected by it. What financial aid will the government be offering universities like Durham so that they can survive the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, we continue to work very closely with the higher education sector. We recognise the important role that they have in many communities, including the City of Durham. And we, a number of weeks ago, announced a stabilisation package. We've also set up a task force with the university sector, the Treasury, the devolved administrations, BEIS and the Department for Education in terms of research funding, and we continue to work closely with the sector to make sure there's stability within it, but it also has the ability to recover and thrive in the future.
Now go to Bob Blackman.
Harrow have continued to remain open so that children of key workers and those with special educational needs continue their education. But still, there are large numbers of children, of course, whose education has slipped. Will he join me in congratulating and thanking the teachers and head teachers who've carried out and continue to provide education throughout this period, but also set out what assessment is going to be made of those children that have fallen behind, so the catch-up package is actually used to the best possible advantage to get those children back to where they should be?
Secretary of State.
I do apologise to my honourable friend because I missed the very start of his question as he was on mute, but it was without doubt the best part of it, I'm sure. And I would very much like to join my honourable friend in thanking all of those teachers, teaching assistants, school support staff who, through the very height of this pandemic, went into school every single day, opened the doors and welcomed those children of critical workers and those most vulnerable children. He picks upon a really important point, and this is why we're working so closely with head teachers and teachers. In terms of actually making sure that we identify the real needs of every single child, and in terms of a catch-up package, in terms of the tutoring that is making sure it's absolutely targeted at their needs and delivers what they need in order for them to be able to catch up. But we do need the class teachers to be able to make those assessments for those children in order to make sure it's the most effective delivery for them.
You now go to Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We all want schools to reopen in September, but only if it's safe for pupils, teachers and the wider community. Just this week, the Health Secretary acknowledged that an unusually high rate of coronavirus infections amongst children in Leicester was part of the reason for reimposing restrictions there. In my own constituency, there's been reports of coronavirus in 3 primary schools. School reopening must be safe and led by the science. So can the Secretary of State confirm that the measures that he's announced today will be signed off as safe by the government's scientists?
Sadly, the honourable gentleman wasn't on mute, but I can absolutely assure the honourable gentleman that Public Health England have signed off all of this advice. And actually, if the honourable gentleman will take the opportunity to read what Public Health England recently said about Leicester, it states that while there had been good provision of primary school access for children since the beginning of June, researchers said that they could find no analytical link between this and any real or apparent rise in new infections in Leicester. We, on this side of the House, are all committed to opening all schools for all children of all year groups. And I look forward to working with the honourable gentleman, and many members on the other side of the House are equally committed to doing the same. But we're only doing this because we know it is safe to do so.
David Simmons.
Madam Deputy Speaker, recognising, as my right honourable friend says, the evidence shows that the risks to and connected to children are very low, mums and dads around the country will have noticed the very stringent protective measures which are being put in place in educational and childcare settings, supported by his department and implemented by multi-academy trusts and local authorities. Could my right honourable friend enlarge a little on his comment in his opening statement about further measures that he might have in mind to ensure that those risks are effectively managed when children return to their educational settings in September?
Secretary of State.
Well, absolutely, I certainly can do. I mean, we have created a strict set of sort of controls that we expect schools to follow as an absolute minimum as they see children return. These are measures that we have worked closely with Public Health England. It's making sure there's good hygiene, there's good cleaning, it's reducing the amount of contact between pupils. The system of creation of bubbles has worked successfully. And as I've touched upon, we've seen over 1.6 million children benefit from returning to school as a result of this from the 1st of June. But we do accept that more needs to be done with every child coming back. And that's why we've done such detailed guidance and will continue to support schools to bring every child back in a safe way that's not just safe for the children, but it's also safe for those who work in schools.
Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State about the broad and balanced curriculum, specifically the PE and sport premium, and whether this will be guaranteed for September? Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is July. Decisions needed to be taken before now about sport and PE. And if head teachers and parents find out that this financial commitment has been held up for purely political reasons so the Chancellor can announce it next week, I cannot imagine how cross they are going to be.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, speaking for myself, one thing I know I certainly gained during lockdown was sadly weight. And I recognise that actually getting children back into school is going, as they get back into school, making sure that they have that broad and balanced curriculum, making sure that they have proper and full access to sporting activities is so incredibly important. The Honourable Lady will just have to sort of pause a little bit as we will be bringing absolute clarity for all schools on this issue exceptionally shortly.
Madam Deputy Speaker, parents across West Sussex will be welcoming today's announcement, particularly as it relates to children with special educational needs. Can I also congratulate the Shadow Education Secretary on her recent appointment? And does the Secretary of State share my hope that no one wants to see children used as political pawns, that we may now see a more constructive approach from Her Majesty's opposition.
Very much hope that we have a broad and exceptionally constructive approach right across, from all sectors of society. We are all united in the desire to see every child get that brilliant education that so many of us have benefited from, and we will always work together, and my door is always open to anyone to ensure that we deliver the very best education for every child, and that's what I will continue to do.
Munira Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to the heroic teachers who've been working so hard across schools in my constituency of Twickenham, and also the September for Schools campaign led by my constituent Fiona Forbes, who's tried to make the voice of parents heard in this whole debate. And many of those parents are wondering what provision and plans will be made for wraparound care. They're on their knees juggling work and homeschooling and wondering whether they'll be able to have after-school clubs and other such provision come the autumn.
It's an important point that the Honourable Lady raises, and as part of the guidance that we've issued, we've set out clear guidance about wraparound care for schools to be able to offer, because we know how incredibly important that is for so many working parents and how it supports them in order for them to be able to do their work.
Tom Hunt.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as a Member of Parliament for Ipswich and an avid Newcastle United fan, I cannot think of a better name for a school than the Sir Bobby Robson School. The Sir Bobby Robson School will be opening its doors in September, and I've become an Associate Governor. It's there to specifically support children with complex emotional and mental needs. The approach that they're going to take is to have a transition period, where almost a therapeutic approach, where they really think about trying to re-socialise vulnerable young adults so that they can reintegrate and catch up. Will my right honourable friend firstly join me in wishing Sir Bobby Robson School all the best for the future, and secondly provide them and other special schools the support they need and the external expertise they need to make sure that these vulnerable young adults have all the best chance to crack on and have a bright future?
If we're going to get everybody in, it's quite important that we have short, punchy questions to the Secretary of State and short answers too. Secretary of State.
Well, I'd very much like to welcome and sort of congratulate my honourable friend for his work with the Sir Bobby Robson School. As a Wolves fan, I'm not sure if it was quite the right person to name it after, and I look forward to working with him and the school to make sure, as they bring children back, making sure that they actually have the best education, how we can assist them and him in terms of delivering that for those children.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State would agree with the 15,000 parents in the Rock the Cotswold group who will be very disappointed if any of their children aren't able to go back into school in September. Would he therefore consider doing two things, as well as issuing the comprehensive guidelines, then ask every head to produce a back-to-school plan, preferably by the end of the summer holidays, by the end of the summer term?
My honourable friend raises an important point. That's very much what heads will be doing to ensure that there is full education across all year groups, in all classes, for every child, including in his constituency.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Further education institutions were already struggling prior to this crisis, and it will only have gotten worse in recent months. Now, those very same institutions are going to have to do a Herculean effort if they're going to get their learners ready for those vital qualifications in the next academic year. Might the Secretary of State explain to further education leaders in my community why they were excluded from the COVID catch-up fund and what support will be available instead?
We continue to work very closely with the sector, a vitally important sector, as we look towards the economic recovery that we're going to be building towards as we come out of this pandemic. We'll work very closely with them in terms of actions and support that they need in order to help those youngsters who need to catch up, but equally to ensure that every further education college is fully open for September.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has already made the point that our schools make a significant contribution to the general well-being of our children as well as to their academic education. But can I ask him to recognise the sad likelihood that as children return to school in September, more of them than usual will report to teachers and others in school disturbing or abusive experiences they've had during the lockdown period, either physical or virtual? And can he confirm that our schools will have the support they need to deal effectively with those reports?
Quite right.
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend touches on an incredibly sensitive but important issue, and we have been working very closely, not just with schools but also with local authorities and the police, in terms of establishing local partnerships to support schools as they deal with some of the consequences of children not having the protection that schools have often wrapped around them. We recognise the sensitivity of this, and if I can pay tribute to the Home Office and the work that the police have done in terms of forging new partnerships with schools and local authorities, so action can be taken much swifter where there is fears and concerns about the well-being of children.
Now I go to Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As more children return to school, what extra support is being provided to disabled children so they can catch up following the COVID-19 pandemic? And will the Minister confirm if assistive technology is being offered as part of the distribution of laptops and tablets to pupils working from home? And if he's unaware, can the Minister please follow up and commit to writing to me with an answer?
Well, we've had a broad range of measures to actually assist all children, including children who suffer from, who have special needs, in terms of how we actually can help them. Many children within this sector have benefited from free laptops and and as part of the COVID catch-up, key elements of that will be helping those children to be able to catch up on what they've lost. But I'll happily write to you, as the Honourable Lady seems to be signalling on the screen, with further details on that.
Edward Timpson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Fully reopening schools in September is absolutely the right thing to do, but for some children the experience of lockdown will have been characterised by social isolation, a lack of routine, and in some cases trauma. What is my right honourable friend doing through the guidance that's been published today and other measures to help schools with what will be an increase in poor behaviour in schools from September? And can I encourage him to bring forward recommendations in the Timpson review of school exclusion so that we don't see children being removed from school when they've only just returned?
Well, it did have a very thoughtful author, that review, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we'll certainly be moving forward on that. Our guidance does recognise some of the real challenges that we're going to see many children facing as they come back into school. They will not have had the same structures of behaviour and discipline built around them. But it is absolutely vital that we re-establish proper behaviour and discipline practices for all children. And I know schools are working very closely with how they build that around those children. But we've got to understand that where you have good behaviour and discipline policies, you have vastly reduced numbers of those children who are being excluded from schools. And that's what we're going to be working with schools to deliver. And I'd like to pay tribute to Tom Bennett and the behaviour hubs and the work that they do to establish strong behaviour practices in some of the most challenging schools.
Now go to Sir David Evanet.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I welcome my right honourable friend's statement on the autumn opening of educational settings. Going to university is an important milestone for many of our young people, but I know there are real worries about starting or restarting their courses this autumn. What measures is he taking and what reassurance can he give to these students?
I'd very much like to reassure both my right honourable friend and all students who are looking forward at the prospect of going to university next academic year, about the importance that we place not just on the educational offer that these universities offer, but also the whole experience of going to university. And we're working very closely with Universities UK and the whole sector to ensure that we have a full and wide proper opening of all universities so they can welcome students through their gates. We're seeing a positive increase in the number of children, young people who are applying to go to university, and we'll work with the sector to deliver on that for them. And just as a point of note, there'll be revised guidance for the HE sector, which will be issued later on today.
Emma Buck. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the outset of this pandemic, the government ignored the warnings from other countries about the seriousness of coronavirus. As a result, measures implemented were too late and cost lives. The World Health Organization Director of Europe has said schools reopening has led to local flares of cases right across member states, even with social distancing in place. Will the Secretary of State publish the scientific advice he is relying on that states social distancing isn't needed anymore in our primary classes?
Well, as the Honourable Lady will probably know, that SAGE regularly produces and publishes its advice and evidence, and we've been completely open on this. But I'm not quite sure what the Honourable Lady is suggesting, that we just never open schools. Are we just going to deprive our children forever more of an education and just accept that until there is a vaccine, children will not be able to go back into school? We recognise that there are big challenges ahead, and that's why we've worked closely with the sector, because we understand the consequences to children are great by not getting them back into school, and that's why we'll continue to strain every sinew to ensure that every child is back in school.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Secretary of State's statement, but I'll be grateful if he could specifically set out the financial support that will be provided to further education at sixth form colleges like East Coast College in my constituency. This is so absolutely vital, particularly to coastal towns, if we are not to let down a whole generation.
Well, as I'm sure my honourable friend will be aware, over the last year we've seen lots of additional support going into the college sector, including the increase in the basic level of money that every college gets. That was an increase of £450 million for this financial year, plus the £1.5 billion that's going into capital funding within the college sector to boot, and £200 million of that has been brought forward into this financial year. We'll continue to work closely with the college sector, both further education colleges and sixth forms, to look at what additional support we can give them as we move into the next phase of dealing with this coronavirus and this global pandemic, and making sure that every child is able to catch up.
We now go to Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join also in welcoming my friend and neighbour, the member for Stretford and Urmston, to her new role? For families who qualify, free school meal vouchers will be a crucial lifeline across the summer. But a school in my constituency faces having to pay for the cost of these themselves because they're using vouchers from the co-op rather than the Eden Red scheme. So will the Secretary of State now guarantee that every school is reimbursed for the full cost of providing free school meal vouchers to their pupils this summer, wherever they get their vouchers from?
We have set up a wide-ranging system of support through the Eden Red scheme that schools are able to access. If there are exceptional circumstances as to whether there are no local supermarkets that those schools are able to access that aren't included on the Eden Red scheme, we're able to look at that in terms of how we're able to support the school and reimburse their costs if there is no alternatives.
Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I reiterate the many calls from here today and from our heads that they really do need clear, unambiguous and timely guidance? And linked to that, isn't one of the biggest scandals of recent months how few children on EHC plans have been accepted back into school, even when their parents want them to go? For that cohort, catch-up is going to be absolutely crucial. Particularly to regularise them again for being back in a school environment after 6 months out of it. He's talked about tutors. Will he also consider the idea that I put forward to use that cohort of students deferring going to university who can come into schools, work alongside some of those children and give them intensive mentoring, not just academically, but to get them back in the habit of being in school and learning again?
Secretary of State.
As my honourable friend is probably aware, in the first guidance that we issued in terms of school closures, one area that we did highlight is that children with EHCP, EHC plans, would able to have continued access to schools all the way through that. I'd be very happy to organise for my honourable friend to be able to have a meeting with the Education Endowment Foundation, who are working with us to stand up our tutoring programme, and I know that looking at a whole range of options in order to be able to mobilise that.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask what extra support the Minister can give to holiday schemes? So things like, not the free school meal side of things, but things like Bristol's healthy holiday schemes where you have play schemes, perhaps forest school activities, physical activities. I think that would be an excellent way of children socialising again, becoming acclimatised to the idea that they are going back to school. So can he please try to support some of these local initiatives?
The Honourable Lady raises a valuable point about, of course, we often talk about the learning loss, but other things that children have missed out on in terms of the socialisation, the physical activity and sports that they would have so often enjoyed. We do have our holiday activity plan, which is a £9 million investment that we sort of rolled out across a large number of local authority areas. And we've also been working very closely with the National Citizenship Service to be able to repurpose a lot of the activity that they've done in terms of the traditional schemes they've done, they're able to work with local schools. And I'd be very happy to put the Honourable Lady in touch with the National Citizenship Service to see if that's something that they could work more, Citizenship Service, they could sort of work closely with some of her schools as to whether that would be a possibility.
Christine Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. It's certainly very welcome news that schools will be reopening, especially for those with SEND and those most disadvantaged pupils. The NEU threatened to name and shame head teachers who were working to reopen their schools previously. Will my right honourable friend join me in condemning this attitude, and ask the party opposite if they will condemn it too?
I think where we need to go, and I'm sure that my honourable friend, who I know has a deep knowledge of the education sector, is this is the time for every person to come together and to work together to ensure that every child is back. And there have been some practices where we've seen head teachers under incredibly, great pressure from sort of certain levels of activism. And I would hope that as we look forward to full opening in September, everyone comes together to work out how we get every child in school, in every class, in every year group. And I have no doubt that every union will also be doing that and working with us.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad the Secretary of State has bothered to start engaging with frontline staff via their representatives in the unions. But one of the things that will face Britain is a huge economic downturn. Many parents may have lost their jobs or have reduced salaries. Will the Secretary of State follow the leadership of Bratton Hove City Council, where they have issued guidance on school uniforms and other costs, so that no parent is forced into poverty and no child is excluded from school because they can't afford the right equipment? Will the Secretary of State give guidance to all schools to ensure that those costs are capped?
The Honourable Gentleman obviously hasn't noticed, but we already issued guidance about keeping uniform costs low, but I'd be happy to share it with him so that he may be able to take the time to read it.
David Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that all children going back in September is particularly important for our poorest children, and that if people try and obstruct that return, it's standing in the way of both social mobility and social justice for our most disadvantaged? Yeah.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Those who stand in the way of children being able to return to school are standing in the way in the best interests of those children who are from the most deprived backgrounds and need the most help and most support. That is why we will get every child back in the new term.
Final question, Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Madam
Deputy Speaker, and I welcome this statement. Clearly it's vital to get children back into school now that we're seeing the infection rates of this virus falling. Can the Secretary of State, though, inform the House that what preparations are the Department for Education carrying out in case there is a second wave to this virus? We all obviously hope and pray that that doesn't happen, but should that happen in, let's say, the autumn or the winter, what preparations is the Department for Education carrying out for that?
As part of the guidance we've issued is a heavy emphasis in terms of the continuity of education. So we do not see any form of disruption in terms of the learning patterns that children would suffer if we're in a position where you see local lockdowns in communities or different areas, which would mean that schools were not able to remain open.
Thank you. I have to announce a correction to the division result. I've received a report from the tellers in the I lobby informing me that there was an error in the result announced to the House of the division held yesterday on new clause 1 to the finance bill. The number of members who voted aye was 252, not 232 as reported. The discrepancy was a result of human error by the tellers. It was not related to the pass reader recording system. There is no change to the outcome of the division. I will direct the Clerk of the House to ensure that the journal is corrected accordingly. Thank you. I shall now suspend the House for 3 minutes to allow the safe exit of members in this piece of business and safe entry of those in the next. Thank you. So you Order. order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Finance Bill as amended in the Public Bill Committee to be further considered.
No.
Thank you. We will start with new clause 27, with which it will be convenient to debate new clause 2, new clause 4, new clause 17 and amendment 1. I call Bridget Phillipson to move new clause 27.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move new clause 27, standing in my name and that of my honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, and other honourable friends. This new clause calls for the Government to lay a review before Parliament, considering all the tax reliefs within this Act, their effect on taxation revenue and the effectiveness of systems to evaluate these reliefs and to ensure value for money. Now, we know that there are real problems with how the Government monitors tax reliefs. Thanks to the outstanding work of the National Audit Office and its report from February this year, we can see how unwieldy the system has become over the last decade and how much this is costing the public purse. It shows that there are currently 362 tax reliefs which support government economic and social objectives. This is a huge financial undertaking. The cost of tax reliefs for 2018-19 is estimated to be £155 billion. As the National Audit Office note, this isn't money that would simply be recouped in tax if these reliefs were abolished, and that is not a point that we are seeking to make. And we on the opposition benches do not doubt that sometimes the outcomes from tax reliefs can be positive and that they can drive positive social and economic behaviour. The problem, as the NAO's report makes plainly clear, is that we simply don't know enough about this because the Government is failing to properly monitor and evaluate their effectiveness. Out of those 362 tax reliefs, only 111 have been costed by HMRC and only 15 have had published evaluations since 2015. At the same time, on the Government's watch, their cost has been rising since 2010. Now, in normal times, such an enormous cost, without a corresponding lack of effective oversight, would be an area of real concern. And as the Office for Budget Responsibility identified in July 2019, tax reliefs are considered to be a new fiscal risk to public finances due to the Government not knowing their full cost and the lack of transparency built into the system. But of course, we are not in normal times. We are living through an incredible economic crisis, and the lack of effective monitoring and evaluation is hard to justify when our public services are under such enormous strain. The inattention shown by ministers over the last decade must change, and we need to see a much greater focus on ensuring value for money. Now, in committee, we touched on one particular area where I'd like to ask the Minister to respond further today, and that's on the social investment tax relief, an area also pressed by my honourable friend, the member for Ilford North, and my frontbench colleague, the member for Liverpool Walton. What further consideration has the Minister given to extending this relief from April 2021 to April 2023, and can he update us on what further consideration the Treasury has given in this area arising from discussions we held at committee? This is an important area, one that's been raised by many charities. I know the Minister is sympathetic to the concerns that they raise, and I'm sure that they will be grateful for any further updates he might be able to provide in this area. The new clause that we lay before the House today paves the way for a greater focus on value for money by establishing a more systematic and transparent way for the Government to evaluate the cost of tax reliefs and to empower Parliament to scrutinise this more effectively. Now, the limiting scope of amendments to the Finance Bill set by the Government means that we've only been able to opt for a review of the tax reliefs contained within this bill. There are many changes to tax reliefs, for instance the entrepreneurs' relief and the annual allowance, that will potentially have a significant impact on tax revenues. In other areas, there are concerns about whether tax reliefs are being abused. Taxwatch UK have highlighted particular concerns around the future of R&D tax credits, given the evidence of abuse in recent years. It's therefore right that there is greater transparency around this. The Parliament can properly scrutinise whether the measures proposed by Government are having their intended effect. Now, the Minister attempted to address some of these concerns in committee, saying that the Government kept all of these reliefs under review and that he has proposed a more systematic evaluation programme for tax reliefs. Now, we would welcome any progress towards such a system, Although if the picture was so rosy, I do doubt whether the National Audit Office would have painted such a concerning picture in their report. I also look forward to the Public Accounts Committee's report on this issue to find out whether they agree with the Minister's assessment or what further insight they might be able to offer in this area. Nonetheless, there is a wider point that this amendment attempts to get to, which is that Parliament currently has few proper and meaningful opportunities to scrutinise tax reliefs on an ongoing basis. The Minister will know of the joint 2017 report by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Institute for Government and the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Better Budgets, Making Tax Policy Better. Now, it states that the information publicly available to Parliament on the costs and benefits of tax expenditure is not sufficient for it to assess their value for money. And they point out that although taxes constitute almost 40% of national income, Parliament has little standing support to look at tax legislation, support general inquiries on tax issues, or to help with post-implementation reviews. This report had a clear recommendation: increased support to Parliament on tax issues. Now, this means going beyond the support currently available and the opportunities that exist in Finance Bill committees, through the Treasury Select Committee, through the Public Accounts Committee and through other work in this House, and instead embedding a proper system where we can assess the value for money of past tax measures. Now, this is hardly controversial. As the Resolution Foundation points out, the governments of Canada, Australia and New Zealand produce annual tax expenditure statements which can be accompanied by parliamentary debate. We want to see improved scrutiny on whether money is being well spent to ensure that the system is fair and that it helps those who need it most. Because when we consider that when all benefits and tax reliefs are taken into consideration, the government provides more support to the richest fifth of non-retired households than to the poorest fifth, and that gap has grown since 2010. Now, this, of course, is in part due to the system of tax reliefs that have flourished under this government and previous Conservative governments, which are clearly not based on any genuine notion of fairness. And today, as we grapple with the looming jobs crisis that we face, this question of fairness is paramount. We need to create a recovery from coronavirus that benefits everyone in our society, from young to old, right across every region and nation. We on these opposition benches don't doubt the scale of this challenge. Our public finances are enormously stretched. Our public services have been pushed to the brink by this pandemic, and there is a risk of unemployment at a scale unseen since the 1980s. And we've yet to hear anything about the economic support package that we need. A back-to-work budget that helps those at the sharp end of the looming jobs crisis. A budget that creates jobs and supports people back into work and properly invests in our young people so that they have the opportunities they deserve at this challenging time. When our public finances are under such enormous pressure, we can only do our best to ensure that there is genuine value for money, that every penny is spent fairly and wisely. A review of tax reliefs in this bill is just a starting point, a step towards what we want to see from these benches, which is a broad review of all tax reliefs. This will help us to know for sure who is benefiting from the hundreds of tax reliefs that exist, whether they're fair and whether they represent good value for money and whether they are having their intended effect. And I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Minister can respond to those points and give us some assurances that the Government will do a lot more in this area so that as we start to emerge from this crisis, we can have confidence that taxpayers' money is being spent well.
Review of tax reliefs.
The question is that new clause 27 be read a second time. Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Very keen to talk very briefly in this debate just about the Future Fund, which is dealt with under new clause 22, which deals with those who have benefited from tax relief under the EIS, SEIS schemes and making sure those tax reliefs are not withdrawn. Very important tax reliefs. I've set up a number of companies in the past and I declare my interest, Madam Deputy Speaker, and some of the capital that has been needed to invest in those companies has been solicited through the use of EIS and SES schemes, which are very, very effective, encouraging high net worth individuals and angel investors to invest in small start-up, scale-up businesses. And the Future Fund is there really for bigger businesses, very high growth businesses to attract capital. And it's a very effective scheme in that the government effectively matches the funding that's attracted through individual investors or from venture capital investors. And it's incredibly important, I think, as we do start to recover from this crisis and see the opportunities ahead, that we do encourage more equity investment. The UK is particularly reliant on debt financing in terms of how our businesses start up and scale up, where other countries are much more effective at delivering equity finance solutions, which is incredibly important because the government at the moment is investing a huge amount in terms of guaranteed loans, about £35 billion through the bounce back loan schemes and the CBIL schemes, which businesses are making a decision on in terms of debt finance. But in terms of equity finance, the government doesn't always have the best record in deciding which businesses to support, and that's why the Future Fund is a very good scheme, in that it fund matches private sector investment, which is much better at determining which businesses are the right ones to support. Individual investors are much better at picking winners than governments. But as we move forward, there's going to be some huge corrections in the private sector. Certainly lots of businesses have borrowed money through this time to get them through this crisis, and many of those businesses, it's fair to say, will not be able to pay that money back. There's a report by the Recapitalisation Group, which is a consortium headed by Ernst & Young and Citi UK, that my all-party group on fair business banking has contributed towards, said there'll be about £100 billion of unsustainable debts, not all to the government schemes, this time next year, because of money that's been borrowed by businesses that have been hit by the recession caused by the COVID crisis. To get us through that period of time, or subsequent to that, to prevent business failures, and some businesses will fail, there is no question about it, and jobs will be lost as a result. But it can't just be all about debt finance, and clearly the government can't be expected to simply give grants to keep businesses going. You need to find a different route to encourage private sector investment who are good at picking winners to invest in SMEs and scale-up businesses. So equity finance is going to be critical to this. But what we need to see is something different than the Future Fund, which I say is there to help scale up high-growth businesses. Growth capital, that's the nature of the Future Fund. What we need to see is equity finance for restructuring, rescue and turnaround. So for good businesses that could get through this but aren't the big scale-up businesses. I think the other thing we've seen in the past is equity finance has been used, as I say, for high-growth businesses rather than restructuring and turnaround. But also most equity finance is focused on London, and it's not in the regions. I know, Madam Speaker, you'd be very keen to make sure, like I am, that our regions are well served by equity finance and support for different parts of this country going forward. So we need to have a discussion, a debate about different schemes we can bring forward. And this, certainly I am, as I say, a big fan of the SEIS and EIS schemes. In my view, those schemes should be enhanced. The tax incentives around those schemes should be enhanced for a period of time, because clearly as a high net worth individual, the temptation is to keep your money in the bank for 12 months and not invest and wait till see what happens on the other side of the crisis. So we've got to encourage those people to try and put some money into businesses today. So a doubling of the incentive, for example, for EIS relief would be very welcome, as well as a loosening of the restrictions that currently apply to EIS investment, such as relatives being able to invest in businesses, would be an appropriate thing to do for the next 12 months. We also, I think, need to relax some of the restrictions on venture capital. There are annual limits on venture capital in businesses and lifetime limits. Those should be doubled, because lots of businesses at the moment will need extra support that the venture capital companies that had been sitting behind those businesses had not expected to have to see into this crisis. So the unreasonable restrictions on those and the amounts of money that can be invested in those businesses at the moment, again, I'm very keen to see the Treasury relax some of those restrictions. Possibly loans based upon a contingent tax liability, kind of student loan system where you repay the loans through future profits, is something we should consider. I know that Lord Bilimoria in the other place is very keen to see a kind of a new 3i scheme where the government puts a significant amount of money, probably £5 billion in his view, into a number of different private equity organisations to sit behind UK businesses. So a number of different measures there. I'll just touch on something that's not directly related to tax relief, but very important in terms of finance. The Minister has been very good at engaging with me on Clause 95 of the Finance Bill, which I think unreasonably restricts the opportunity for businesses to get finance by putting HMRC up the ladder in terms of being a preferred creditor, which may mean that some lenders are less likely to lend. And I do very much caution the Treasury in this area. We should keep a very close eye on that to make sure debt finance is still made available to SMEs going forward. But with that, Deputy Speaker, very, very supportive of what the government's doing in terms of Future Fund. We just need to go a little bit further in certain other areas. Thank you.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise in support of the amendments put forward in my name and those of my SNP colleagues. I think it's important to state from the outset that we hear regularly from across this chamber, albeit not today given it is quite empty for the tax discussion, that the UK's tax relief system is full of inefficiencies. And our core aim through the new clauses proposed is to be constructive and to get to the root of that problem in respect of entrepreneurs' relief by asking the government to undertake a review of the impact on investment of the changes made to the relief itself. And as I stated at committee stage, this can only be a positive thing. After all, there remains varying views on both the effectiveness and efficacy of entrepreneurs' relief, whether it delivers the economic objectives necessary or whether that could be done by other means. And these varying views are clear for all to see. For example, the IFS has been quite critical of the relief, highlighting that it is being poorly targeted, whereas on the converse, the FSB emphasised the importance of the relief to the retirement of business owners. And you know, I've no doubt that we'll hear much from the Minister that they have already undertaken a review, and they have, but an internal review. That is not good enough. And that is of particular importance when we consider the fact that there was much talk in the public domain of entrepreneurs' relief being scrapped entirely at the budget process. A backbench revolt ensued and that position swiftly changed. So instead of scrapping the relief, it has gone from the £10 million back to the £1 million introduced by the Labour Party back in 2008. I'm sure even the Minister would agree that the tail should not be wagging the dog on such important matters. What we need is clarity. Clarity on effectiveness, clarity of efficacy, and clarity on direction. And these points have perhaps never been as important as they are now. As we rebuild our economy following COVID-19, it is more important than ever that tax incentives go to those entrepreneurs who we know will rebuild the economy. And quite neatly, that takes me on to those further new clauses we have tabled in respect of tax avoidance. For as we rebuild the economy, the very last thing we need is individuals and organisations dodging what they are due. Now, on these benches, we have been clear and consistent in highlighting our profound concerns relating to Scottish limited partnerships. Yet, despite the obvious manner in which these can be abused, we are yet to see any real action. And I sincerely hope that in his contribution, the Minister will make a commitment to end the avoidance practices of such partnerships. But I hope he can go further too. For decades, we have seen consecutive UK governments talk the talk on ending tax avoidance. But in 2017-18, HMRC still put the tax gap at £35 billion. Now, I do have some sympathy for the government in this regard, for just as they legislate to close one gap, another one is opened by those who wish to cheat both the system and the public. But there is scope for a comprehensive anti-avoidance rule to be introduced. Now, the government will point to the general anti-abuse rule introduced in 2013, but this has been heavily criticised, not least by the TUC. What we need is workable general anti-avoidance rules that tackle avoidance in all of its forms, including international tax abuse. And more than ever, we need real action to combat Scottish limited partnerships. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious of the fact that you do wish to finish before 2 o'clock, so I do intend to keep my own contribution brief, and I'll move on to my closing remarks, in which I wish to highlight that more can be done to incentivise energy efficiency through tax reliefs, and that similarly more can be done to meet the needs and the demands of the Scottish economy. In respect of the structures and buildings relief, it is clear that the government is making an attempt to amend the system in order to incentivise capital investment, but they can and they should go further. And at risk of repeating myself once again, the easiest step they could take is to scrap VAT on building repairs. In my own constituency of Aberdeen South, I've been struck by just how many homeowners who often live in some of the most beautiful of granite buildings are unable to undertake the repairs and improvements they either want or need due to the high costs involved. As we seek to improve energy efficiency in our homes, particularly in what are often old and cold buildings, surely the government should be assessing every measure to incentivise progress, not just to help rid us of fuel poverty, but to protect both the environment and the future of our planet. Cumulative action to combat climate change is needed, and I would welcome a firm commitment from the Minister in this regard. And on the issue of tax reliefs, it would be remiss of me not to highlight to the Chamber the proposals put forward in recent days by my colleagues in the Scottish Government. I think everyone, even the most ardent of UK Government supporters, was deeply underwhelmed by the plans announced by the Prime Minister to restart the economy, and that collective sigh from across the UK was entirely justifiable, because £5 billion will likely work out to be less than the cost of renovating the very building that we are in at this moment in time. And it is a far cry from the £80 billion of investment called for by the Scottish Government. But importantly, my colleagues did not just call for capital investment, they also called for tax relief. Indeed, they were clear that reducing VAT would be an urgent and must be an urgent act of this government, both in terms of reducing the general rate of VAT from 20% to 15% for 6 months, and importantly, in reducing tourism and hospitality VAT to just 5%. On top of that, a 2p cut in employers' national insurance contributions to reduce the cost of hiring staff was also identified. Unfortunately, as with all too many matters, the hands of the Scottish Government are tied on such issues. The power lies solely with the UK Government, a UK Government that Scotland neither supports nor votes for. But I do hope that the Minister is listening and the wider government are listening too, because now is the time for them to introduce the tax incentives that the Scottish economy needs, to deliver the investment that the Scottish economy needs, and to provide the Scottish Parliament with the borrowing powers it so desperately needs. And if they don't, be ever mindful that they are only doing further damage to the very union they claim to support. Thank you.
Ben Lake.
Madam Deputy Speaker, for calling me to contribute into this very important debate, a debate which perhaps its importance isn't quite reflected in the attendance in the Chamber today. But as the Shadow Minister rightly mentioned in her opening remarks, tax reliefs are incredibly important, not just the reviews into tax reliefs rather, are not just important in improving transparency as to their effectiveness, but as the Honourable Member for Thurston Moulton mentioned with regard to the EIS and the Future Fund, they can have incredibly important and transformative impacts in terms of policy changes. And I'd agree with him that one of the key things that we need to consider as we move ahead is how we can encourage greater investment and equity investment in particular in regions other than London. And I hope to dwell a little bit on that point later on in my remarks. But it is a pleasure to follow my honourable friend from Aberdeen South, who not only quite effectively laid out some of the deficiencies of the existing tax relief system, and raised the important question, which I'd like to address in my own remarks, about whether or not these reliefs are achieving some of their economic objectives in the current climate and context. I think as we turn to try and rebuild, or at least begin to consider how we can rebuild from COVID-19, tax reliefs will have an important part to play, and I think it will be vital that they are targeted or channeled to those who will rebuild the economy. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to speak greater length on Amendment 1 and New Clause 17, both of which are tabled in my name. Both are probing amendments which seek to probe the Government's commitment to levelling up every nation and region of the UK by requiring it to report on the differential territorial impacts of the changes this bill will introduce to certain reliefs and tax incentives. I think most honourable members would agree and welcome the concerted efforts to rebalance economic growth throughout the UK, and in particular a move away from what I consider a hub and spoke approach to economic development, which over the past decade has mainly concentrated perhaps on improving connectivity between rural areas and smaller towns to the supposed economic engines of the larger cities, as opposed to incentivising and supporting economic growth in these areas themselves. Now, such a centralised model has inevitably concentrated economic activity in London and the South East region. As a consequence, Wales's potential, in addition to that of other regions and nations of the UK, has been overlooked. This is perhaps most apparent when we consider the way in which public funding for research and development has been allocated. For a moment, if we consider that between 2001 and 2017, London received R&D funding per head, totalling almost twice the UK average, figures of £3,900 per head compared to a national average of £2,300. And what's more, the trend has worsened in that time. The share of the core research budget spent across the three cities of Oxford, Cambridge and London, also known as the Golden Triangle, has risen from 42.1% in 2002-03 to 46% in 2017-18. Now, perhaps just as relevant to this debate is how public spending on transport infrastructure is allocated. And I note on this measure, per head spending in London over the past decade averages nearly 3 times that spent in the rest of the UK. During the same period, the city had received 5 times the average per head spend on culture. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that given this disparity, the Golden Triangle of London, the South East of England and the East of England also attracts the lion's share of venture capital. Indeed, the region received 73% of all venture capital between 2016 and 2018, according to the British Venture Capital Association. And when we reflect upon this concentration of venture capital in one region of the UK, as with R&D, not only are the failings of past economic development policy laid bare, but it is also difficult to deny a popular saying in Ceredigion, "I'r pant yr hyd y dŵr," or in English, "to the hollow the water runs." Now, it is clear that as the world moves increasingly to a knowledge-driven economy, expenditure on R&D will be vital not only as a source of innovation that could be commercialised to form the basis of the next generation of business, but also as a means of equipping people with the requisite skills for the new economy, and as my honourable friend for Aberdeen South mentioned, the post-COVID economy. It follows, therefore, that the economy of any nation or region that does not receive this level of support will be hindered in its attempt to adjust to the challenges of tomorrow. Government support for R&D is essential for Wales, in particular, to address problems ranging from a low-wage economy to a looming demographic time bomb, while also building an economic platform to take advantage of trends, including automation, which could otherwise pose quite a serious long-term social risk. New Clause 17 would require the Chancellor to report on the geographical impact of changes to several tax reliefs, but including R&D expenditure credit. This would ensure the UK Government considers how different geographic areas benefit from taxpayer-funded reliefs, so that the financial incentives can be better tailored to overcome the chronic regional inequalities of the UK. I have previously drawn attention to the concentration of R&D funding in the Golden Triangle, but assessments might also provoke a debate within government about how public spending on other priorities is allocated. And in a similar vein, Amendment 1 in my name would require the government to consider the unsustainable concentration of private investment in one region of the UK at the expense of the devolved nations and other regions of England. As the UK government narrows the applicability of the Enterprise Investment Scheme, it needs to consider how this will impact on firms in different areas of the UK. The EIS benefits us in a great many ways. The Honourable Member for Thurston-Melton outlined them quite effectively in his remarks. And how the UK government can encourage the establishment of venture capital funds and therefore private investment in the devolved nations is so important. Again, the geographic disparities to which I've already referred in my remarks is reflected in the EIS, just to pick on one example. Between 2015 and 2018, only 210 Welsh firms benefited from EIS, receiving just 1.3% of total investment. In contrast, again, to pick on the Golden Triangle, that area received 67% of all investment, And the average UK business angel investment per firm has been over 40% greater than that in Wales. Now, modern advanced economies such as Germany, the Netherlands and even the US of A have ensured that a better geographic spread of economic prosperity can happen. And so the government's intention to address this policy failure is to be welcomed. However, we must make sure that the rhetoric is backed up by reality and that the measures designed to realise such lofty ambitions are fit for purpose. My amendments would require the government to report on the effectiveness of some tax relief schemes in this regard, and I do hope that the Minister can give them some serious consideration. Thank you.
Minister Jessie Norman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to everyone who's contributed to this very short but very interesting debate. And as colleagues have noted, when we think about tax transparency, we are in what I think these days is referred to as a niche area of taxation, technical, but no less important, in some respects more important, that we not get lost in the detail, but be able to come back and talk about these issues more widely. If I may, what I'll do is address the different clauses and then come to the specific points that have been raised in the debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, new clause 27 would require the government to review all tax reliefs contained in the Act. States that the review must contain the following: the number of tax reliefs, the effect of taxation revenue for each of the reliefs, and an assessment of the efficacy of systems for designing, monitoring and evaluating the effect of the reliefs. It asks the government to publish the number of tax reliefs within this bill and the effect on taxation revenue of the reliefs. As the House may be aware, the government already publishes tax changes and estimates of the exchequer impacts of the policy change in the budget documents at each fiscal event. Moreover, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs monitor the effect on taxation revenue of tax reliefs after they're introduced, and they issue an annual tax relief statistics publication, which I'm sure will be closely scrutinised by all members of the House, which includes estimates of the costs of tax reliefs. Building on this, HMRC are also undertaking a project to expand their published cost information, and I'm pleased to remind the House that in May, HMRC published cost estimates for a further 47 previously uncosted reliefs. The new clause also asks for an assessment of the efficacy of systems for designing, monitoring and evaluating the effect of the reliefs. As the House will know, the government consults on new tax reliefs and proposed changes to tax reliefs, bringing in external expertise as part of the policy-making cycle. Wherever possible, officials are constantly working on ways to improve the policy, development, administration and continuing management of reliefs. As colleagues will know, the government, and in particular the Treasury, keeps all reliefs under review. The government also does evaluations of different forms, and this work has included evaluations of a number of significant reliefs, some 15 since 2015. For example, R&D tax credits and entrepreneurs relief, on both of which I'll say a couple of words later on. In 2015, HMRC published an evaluation on R&D tax credits. In 2017, they commissioned an evaluation of entrepreneurs relief that led to a series of reforms, most recently the significant reduction of the lifetime limit at Spring Budget 2020, which is legislated in this bill. The Honour of Aberdeen South picks up the point about entrepreneurs relief and somehow regards it as the tail wagging the dog. What he calls the tail wagging the dog, other people would call consultation across Parliament and discussion with stakeholders. Since it resulted in a 90% reduction of the scope of the relief, I don't think he can claim there's any lack of ambition in the measure. HMRC will continue to monitor and evaluate reliefs and will bring forward a pipeline of further evaluations in due course, as well as considering a proposal to which I have already said I'm quite sympathetic, and I thank the Honourable Lady, and we've had a discussion on this before, for a more systematic evaluation programme for reliefs. In light of all this, the government does not believe that this amendment is necessary. If I turn to new clause 2, This would require the Chancellor of the Exchequer to review the impacts of the reduction in the lifetime limit of entrepreneurs' relief being legislated in this bill within 6 months of royal assent, and specifically to review the impacts on business investment, employment and productivity in the constituent nations and English regions of the United Kingdom. I would first highlight to honourable members that the government has already conducted an internal review of this relief, which built on the 2017 independent research commissioned by HMRC. That review considered the distributional effects and benefits of the relief against its cost in order to understand better the targeting of the relief. And of course, it in turn has been used to inform the reform that is being legislated for in this bill. And of course, it ensures that the majority of entrepreneurs are unaffected. A lot of the concern about entrepreneurs' relief historically has been that it's not well targeted, and this greatly improves the targeting of the relief. Unfortunately, the effects of these changes to the relief will not be visible within 6 months' time, and for that reason I would urge the House to reject new clause 2. On new clause 4, which concerns structures and buildings allowance, this would require the Chancellor to review the impacts of clause 30, which makes miscellaneous amendments to the SBA within 6 months of the passing of the Finance Act. And specifically, it would require the Chancellor to review the impacts on business investment, employment, productivity and energy efficiency. I think, again, I would reassure members that both the Revenue and Customs and the Treasury already monitor tax reliefs according to the level of risk that they are deemed to pose. Of course, it's in the nature of a structures and buildings allowance that it is configured to reflect the fact that it can take many years to erect new buildings, and claims under the SBA are ordinarily settled when businesses bring buildings into use and submit tax returns at year end. And for that reason, it would be neither possible nor appropriate to try to draw conclusions on the productivity or energy efficiency impacts of those changes within such a short period of time. If I turn to clause 17, this would require the government within 12 months to assess and report on the geographical effects of changes to business reliefs across a variety of areas. There is a concern, and I recognise it, that there is a geographic disparity, and that reflects historic evolution of our economy in different areas, and it's by no means a uniform picture even outside London. HMRC do not routinely require businesses to provide geographical information about where expenditures are incurred as part of claims for the R&D expenditure credit, structures and buildings allowance, or intangible fixed assets. In order to do that, changes would be required which would create additional burdens for businesses. And of course, those claiming those reliefs would only be able to provide information after the year end. For that reason, it's not possible that HMRC, even if it were even if this measure were passed, would have that information within the 12 months stated in the amendment. It's not capable of being fulfilled. HMRC do in fact already publish annual statistics on many tax reliefs, including a detailed breakdown of R&D tax relief claims, which analyses both by region and sector the number of claims and the amount of relief received. However, this regional analysis is based on companies' registered offices, not necessarily where expenditure is incurred. And although the next set of annual R&D relief statistics will be published by HMRC in the autumn, companies can claim R&D tax relief for up to 2 years after the end of their accounting period. So for that reason, the 2020 release will only include claims up to 2018-19, and therefore will not include claims for the increased 13% rate. The government remains, as the House will know, firmly committed to level up across the regions and nations of the UK, and the spring budget provided a £1.14 billion increase to block grant for devolved administrations to spend on their own priorities, in addition to £2.7 billion invested in city deals and another £800 million of funding to support 4 deals in Wales alone, and £1.4 billion, of which and a further £1.4 billion being provided for 10 deals in Scotland. So we fully recognise the importance of supporting regional and devolved administration growth. Finally, on the Enterprise Investment Scheme, this Clause 36, Amendment 1, would require the government to review the economic and geographical impacts of the existing EIS. Now, we did, of course, consider this at Public Bill Committee, and I appreciate the intention of honourable members to use the EIS more strategically, but it has been specifically designed to address a market failure for young, innovative UK companies which seek to obtain patient equity finance in order to grow, and we would not wish to pull it away from that important national function. Companies that use EIS can register wherever they please in the UK, and again, a registered office does not need to be in the same place as to where the bulk of their staff are employed. With your permission, I will just spend a minute or two longer, Madam Deputy Speaker, just addressing specific points raised. The Honourable Lady opposite discussed the tax relief system as unwieldy. It's a view I would share. I think it is unwieldy. I think more work needs to be done. It's grown up over time. I certainly, no one in the government would regard the position as rosy. You know, I should say, the House will know that we receive many billions of pounds, including one just recently, in requests for VAT relief alone. Everyone seems to be terribly keen on improving and tidying up reliefs, but they're also terribly keen on increasing the number of reliefs in their particular area or for their particular sector, for perfectly good democratic reasons we understand, but that creates a natural tension. And of course, as relief costs rise, that's sometimes a very good thing. For example, with R&D expenditure credits, where it's supporting, we know it supports high value for money investment, and others it may not be such a good thing. If I can pick up the Honourable Gentleman's point from Thurston Moulton before he intervenes, he's jumped the gun a little bit on me, because we will be discussing New Clause 22 in the next session, and therefore, if he really wishes to land his point, he only has to hang around a little bit longer. But I can give him a sneak preview by saying that New Clause 22 makes sure that people who have made investments under EIS or SEIS schemes do not lose reliefs on those investments, and so it responds to the concern he raised. Recapitalisation is an important issue. It's obviously one the government's closely attending to, and he's right to focus on it. Final point, the Honourable Gentleman Ceredigion makes the point about the importance of greater equity investment in the regions. I very much agree with him, and before I sit down, I will, with deference to the Madam Deputy Speaker, give way to my friend.
I'm very grateful. Is there an intention, I speak as somebody who's benefited from entrepreneurs relief in the past, so I declare my interest. Is he considering extending the reduction in entrepreneurs relief, which I do support, to investors relief, which currently stands at the same figure entrepreneurs relief used to stand at £10 million?
Minister.
Well, I think if he's asking questions, he has to stay to the next debate, because he's abusing the privilege of this debate. But let me say this. I thank him for his suggestion for a revenue-raising possibility for the government. We take all those in great heart. And with that, I will sit down.
Shadow Minister Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was just going to ask the Minister there whether he could say a little more around the social investment tax relief. I'm not aware that he responded on that point.
Take that as an intervention, of course. No, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right, and let me address that. She will know that the relief remains in place until next year. I think even its doubtiest supporters would agree that it has not so far been anything like as effective as either anyone would like or as had been projected or anticipated. Only £11.2 million have been raised under it in the period 2014 to 18-19. We're looking closely at it, and I think I mentioned in Public Bill Committee that I am in discussions with leading figures across the social investment world about whether or not we can get some more visibility both on the sources of funds that would use such a relief and on the sources of projects that those funds would support. I think if we don't get that, and we can't have that in a slightly more concrete form, then it really does look like quite an empty request. But there may be other things we can do to support social investment, and as she will know, I've written a book on the big society. This is an area I care very deeply about, so I'm happy to respond. I'm thankful to her question.
Shadow Minister Bridget Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We don't seek to intend to divide the House today on this new clause. I'd just like to make a few brief points in response to what the Minister said today. I'm glad that he shares our assessment of the current situation and the current system as unwieldy, and therefore we look forward to seeing real progress in this area, because frankly it's just not good enough that out of those 362 tax reliefs, only 15 have had published evaluations since 2015, and that is at a time when costs have risen. During these extraordinary times, we need to see much more from the government, not just on tackling tax avoidance, as we discussed at some length yesterday, but a renewed focus on taxpayer value for money, with greater opportunities for scrutiny of tax reliefs, both in this place and from external experts as well. So whilst we're not seeking to divide the House today, I do say to the Minister, I hope we can see progress in this area, and this is an issue to which we do intend to return.
Is it your pleasure that the new clause be withdrawn? New clause by leave withdrawn. We'll have a 3-minute suspension. Order, order. We now come to Government New Clause 19, with which it will be convenient to discuss the selected Government New Clauses and New Scheduled 1 and the selected amendments as listed on the selection paper. Minister Jessie Norman to move.
I beg to move the Government New Clauses 19 to 25 and Government New Clause 32. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Government has tabled 8 new clauses to the bill, the majority of which are in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And if I may, I'd like to start by offering honourable members an explanation as to why these amendments are being brought forward at report stage of the bill. The Government's been working very hard, as the House will know, to combat the pandemic, and these measures are just a small part of a much more extensive and wide-ranging response to it. I'm sure that colleagues across the House will appreciate the rather extraordinary circumstances in which both ministers and civil servants have been working over the past 3 months, and as I often do, I would again pay great tribute to officials both at the Treasury and at HMRC. Without their work, it would not have been possible to deliver many, if any, of these aspects of this extremely comprehensive response, let alone in such a rapid time frame as, for example, with the coronavirus job retention scheme. But we've brought forward the legislation for these new clauses at the earliest possible opportunity during the Finance Bill, and for technical reasons it is therefore at this report stage. We've also been slightly limited by the fact that to table each new clause requires a new Ways and Means resolution to be agreed by the House. Report stage was the first amendable stage of this bill to take place after the government had been able to agree the necessary Ways and Means resolution on the floor of the House. I hope the House will agree there's a clear need for each of these new clauses to stand part of the bill. I will touch on each of the clauses briefly, if I may. Let me begin with new clause 19, which seeks to do two things. First, to confirm that grants made under COVID-related schemes, such as the furlough scheme, the self-employment scheme, the small business grant fund, the retail hospitality and leisure grant fund, local authority discretionary grant fund, and schemes corresponding to those grants within the devolved administrations are subject to tax. The clause also includes delegated power in order to add or remove further grant schemes through a statutory instrument, and that provides sensible flexibility so that the government can continue to support the economy through its response to the pandemic. The second part ensures that HMRC have appropriate and proportionate compliance and enforcement powers in relation to the furlough scheme and the self-employment income support scheme. To ensure that taxpayer money is going only to those who are eligible, the clause gives HMRC powers to recover overpayments and where there is deliberate non-compliance to impose penalties. HMRC have given a clear undertaking that these powers will not be used to penalise taxpayers who may be going through difficult times but make honest mistakes in their applications. As previously stated, the powers are designed to be proportionate, and they balance the fact that we're in unprecedented and uncertain times with the need to ensure that HMRC have sufficient powers to enforce the schemes according to eligibility criteria set out and to protect the exchequer. Madam Deputy Speaker, new clause 20 seeks to mitigate potential pensions impacts for those with the protected pension age returning to work so as to help in the battle against the pandemic. Its purpose is to provide certainty for these people by temporarily suspending rules that would otherwise see the pension income of recent retired people reduced if they were to return to work in crucial workforces at this important time. In order to help those workforces, these retirees have been and will remain critical to the government's response to COVID, and this clause temporarily removes restrictions that might impede a flexible response. New clause 21, Madam Deputy Speaker, temporarily relaxed the statutory residence test so that highly skilled individuals from across the world were not discouraged from coming to the UK and helping this country to respond to the unprecedented health emergency. The actions and presence of normally non-resident individuals in the UK could have inadvertently affected their tax residence status. This is to restrict it, however, to make sure that it only applies between the March the 1st and June the 1st of 2020 for time spent in the UK by individuals who worked specifically on coronavirus disease-related activities in specified sectors. And it means that the statutory residence test will not count towards that time will not count towards the residence test. New clause 22, and here I come to the clause much loved by my absent friend, the member for Thurston-Moulton, modifies the current enterprise investment scheme and seed enterprise investment scheme so that individuals who have made EIS or SEIS investments before a future fund investment in the same company will not lose relief on those previous investments when the future fund loan converts into shares or is repaid. As the House will know, these schemes are intended to encourage investment in smaller, higher risk trading companies by offering tax reliefs to individual investors who subscribe for new shares in qualifying companies. The government announced the Future Fund as part of its business package in response to COVID-19. Current EIS and SEIS legislation means that some future fund investors who've used those schemes for previous investments in the same company might potentially lose their reliefs depending on how and when the loan converts. This clause is intended to ensure that these investors do not lose that relief as a result of investing in the future fund to support innovative UK companies that may have difficulty raising finance during this period. Yes, of course.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very grateful for the Minister for giving way on that point. I wonder if I could press him on the issue of innovative companies having a lack of support from HMRC. I've come across a case in my constituency where a very innovative British company appears to have had a lack of support from the agency. Would he perhaps look into this matter for me?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and as the House will be aware, HMRC is actually often and generally extremely responsive to these issues. I will very happily look at any correspondence he wants to send me, and I will make sure that there is a properly engaged response to the extent that my limited powers over HMRC permit me to do, but I hope that will be effective. Madam Deputy Speaker, New Clause 23 enables the Treasury to specify in an order made under Section 135 of the Finance Act 2008 which payments of tax and other liabilities will not attract late payment interest or surcharge as a result of being deferred by agreement during a period of national disaster or emergency. It also enables the Treasury to set specific relief periods for different deferred taxes or liabilities. As the House will know, government's announced an unprecedented package of economic support for businesses and individuals affected by COVID. The new clause ensures that late payment interest, which would normally accrue automatically where tax is paid late, does not apply, supporting taxpayers further and in ways which I'm sure the whole House would support. The payment deferral for VAT, which we've announced, provides taxpayers themselves with a much needed cash flow boost, and HM Revenue and Customs are using their existing powers as set out in the Commissioners for Revenue and Customs Act 2005 to defer those payments of tax. New Clause 24 allows a refund of the additional 3% higher rate of stamp duty where exceptional circumstances prevented the sale of the previous main residence during a 3-year window within which a sale must ordinarily take place. The new clause applies to those whose refund window ended on or after the 1st of January 2020. It ensures that responsible actions taken by people do not lead to negative tax implications, and that those who would otherwise have received an SDLT refund are still able to receive one despite the pandemic. New Clause 25 suspends the HGV road user levy for a period of 12 months, cutting fixed operational costs to the logistics and haulage industries as the economy begins to recover from the pandemic. These industries support many other industries, and temporarily easing their financial burden will support the haulage sector, reducing fixed costs as the economy recovers over time. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I turn to New Clause 32. New Clause 32 makes a minor change to the existing enterprise management incentives legislation. It introduces a time-limited exception to the disqualifying event rule so that EMI option holders who can no longer meet the EMI working time requirement owing to the pandemic are not forced to forfeit their options or to exercise them earlier than planned. This has the effect of protecting employees furloughed under the coronavirus job retention scheme or who've taken unpaid leave and had their working hours reduced. The measure means that affected employees will not forfeit their options or be forced to exercise them within the statutory 90 days normally required. Since the point of EMI schemes is to help high-growth, small and medium-sized enterprise recruit and retain skilled employees by giving them tax advantage share options, I'm sure the House will understand that this supports a very important sector and one that is likely to be important also to our recovery. The changes will be effective from the 19th of March in order to ensure that employees who are furloughed or had to reduce their hours do not lose out. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope the House will accept the need for these new clauses in these highly uncertain and unusual times, and I commend them to the House.
Taxation of coronavirus support payments.
The question is that Government New Clause 19 be read a second time. Shadow Minister Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Financial Secretary for making the case for the Government's new clauses this afternoon. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, the Labour Party has made clear as the official opposition that we seek to work constructively with the Government, Madam Deputy Speaker, in response to this unprecedented public health crisis that, as we have seen, has brought about an economic crisis to follow. And in that spirit, to ensure the smooth passage of legislation, we've helped to expedite the progress of measures taken by the Government, and this afternoon will be no exception. I do, however, Madam Deputy Speaker, wish to speak to new clause 29, which has been tabled in the name of my honourable friend, the Shadow Chancellor, and other honourable and right honourable colleagues. Yesterday afternoon, I addressed the issue of the government's poverty of ambition on climate change. This afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to address the issue of their poverty of ambition on tackling poverty itself. The Conservative Party has now been in government, either alone or in coalition, for a decade. And over the course of the last 10 years, their record on poverty in this country and tackling poverty in this country has been absolutely lamentable. According to the government's own Social Mobility Commission, 600,000 more children are now living in relative poverty than in 2012. And this is projected to increase further due to benefit changes and the obvious economic impact of COVID-19. As of February 20 this year, around 14 million people were in poverty, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, including 2 million pensioners and 4 million children. And we know that the impacts of poverty are felt disproportionately amongst different communities. Children from black and minority ethnic groups, for example, are more likely to be in poverty, 45% compared with 26% of children in white British families. We believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government is failing on something that should be the most basic of priorities for any government. And it's not just our view as the opposition party. The government's own Social Mobility Commission have said, and I quote, the government should be more proactive in addressing poverty overall. And it's worth bearing in mind that behind every statistics is a child. And 30 years ago, I was one of those children, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the child poverty statistics. Growing up on a council estate in London's East End, sandwiched between the bright lights of the City of London and the glistening lights of what was then the blossoming London Development Corporation land, which has become Canary Wharf, two, now in today's standards, two global financial centres at the centre of our global city, and in between a vista of poverty which was bad then and remains bad now. And one of the things that I find most frustrating about the experience I had growing up in a council flat in the East End in the 1980s is that when I look back on my experience as a child, Madam Deputy Speaker, the conditions of the council flat I lived in, the embarrassment of not wanting to bring friends home from school because the conditions were not ones that we were proud of, and it was a source of shame and embarrassment. When I think about the experience of relying on free school meals and the stigma that arises from having to collect a dinner ticket whilst other children go and pay for their food quickly and get the best food, I hasten to add, whilst handing over their cash. When I think about the difficulties my mum had as a single mum, balancing the challenge of bringing up a child whilst relying on the benefit system and having to make compromises about the choices of how she spent the family budget, the choice between putting food on the fridge or some extra money in the electricity meter. One of the things that makes me most angry is when I think about my experience, which I thought was bad in the 1980s, and compare it with children growing up in the same circumstances today in my own constituency casework. Things have gotten worse for children in the decades that have followed my childhood, when things ought to be getting better. Whereas I had the stability of a council flat, albeit not a nice one, but the stability of a council flat over the roof of my head, today children in my constituency, and no doubt so many others across the chamber, those children are growing up in temporary bed and breakfast accommodation, being moved from pillar to post in substandard accommodation with disruptive consequences for their education and for their schooling, and the inability for them to form lasting friendships and to build supportive, for their families to build supportive networks and family relationships. When I think about the enormous strides that were made, particularly by the last Labour government, in tackling educational disadvantage, I think it's outrageous that in this country, in the 21st century, children still arrive today at school at the age of 5 with their life chances already limited and in many cases predetermined, because we failed to get early years right. Sure Start centres have closed. The support for families is no longer there. And as a result, they arrive at school at 5 less prepared than their peers from more affluent backgrounds. It makes me angry that for all of the difference that was made to my education through programmes under the last Labour government and the impact it has had on children since in terms of the London Challenge and excellence in cities, today children are leaving school at 16 at a time when the attainment gap between children from the most advantaged backgrounds and the least advantaged backgrounds is actually widening, and where the further education system, where many working class young people go on to study, has been described by the government's own Social Mobility Commission as undervalued and underfunded. And this at a time when the changing nature of our economy and the changing nature of the world of work makes post-16 adult education delivered in further education settings more important, not less. We should be making progress, Madam Deputy Speaker, Deputy Speaker, but we are in reverse gear, and I'll give way.
I'm very grateful. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He's making an extremely powerful speech, which focuses us, as we should be, on this vital issue. Does he agree with me that a central part of the problem that many families face is that costs have risen so dramatically, both in terms of food, the cost of rent, the impossibility of being able to afford a home? In my own constituency of Reading, it is very, very difficult for many people to get on the housing ladder. Many young professionals and young families are crammed into flats, which are hugely expensive. They're suffering huge problems also with the high cost of food. Does he agree with me that this is a very significant part of the problem?
I strongly agree with my honourable friend, and that brings me neatly on to the next points I was about to make about the employment conditions in our country. Because for my mum, as a single mum, it was difficult to hold down a steady, stable job. And often she was reliant on temporary, casual, low-paid work to help make ends meet. And I look at today's picture in the labour market, and this was pre-pandemic, where even in households where one or both parents were working, children are still growing up in poverty. Because over the last decade, we have seen, as my honourable friend has said, the bills going up, but the wages failing to follow. And labour market conditions that mean that even when people are doing the right thing, as the vast majority of people want to do, they're going out to work, often in 2, 3, even 4 jobs in a week to make ends meet. Even when they're doing the right thing, working all the hours God sends, they are still unable to make ends meet. And it should never be the case, especially in a country with the wealth and opportunity available, that when someone goes to work and puts in a full week's work, that at the end of the day they still don't have enough to make ends meet. And of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, things are likely to become even more challenging in the wake of the economic fallout of coronavirus. The unemployment statistics we've seen in recent months have been not only jaw-dropping but unprecedented. The pace at which our economy has collapsed as a result of the very necessary shutdown has been really quite astonishing. And though I welcome and recognise the steps that the Chancellor has taken to try to protect people's incomes, unless he goes further than he has already announced, many people will be facing greater poverty and hardship later this year. Against this bleak backdrop, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would expect any Prime Minister, any reasonable Prime Minister, any Prime Minister with the right priorities, any Prime Minister with their heart in the right place, any Prime Minister with even the faintest understanding of what life is like for most people in this country, to make tackling poverty a top priority. But when it comes to this Prime Minister, Mr. Deputy Speaker, he doesn't even know in which direction the poverty numbers are going. I don't expect him to have instant recall of the month-by-month poverty data, though if I were Prime Minister, I would make sure those numbers were on the dashboard that I looked at every single morning. The Prime Minister didn't even know that on his watch, and on the watch of his predecessors, child poverty in this country has been rising. I think that is negligent, and I have to say, having followed the Prime Minister closely during his time as Mayor of London, his lack of attention to detail and his lack of grip on government does not come as a particular surprise. So that brings me to our Chancellor. who many people, Mr Deputy Speaker, believe to be a more impressive political figure and political leader than the Prime Minister. Certainly that's the talk of the Tories in the tea room. Mr Deputy Speaker, it remains to be seen whether this Chancellor, a Chancellor who says he will do whatever it takes to get the country through the pandemic, is also prepared to do whatever it takes to tackle poverty in our country. Because we know it can be done, and we know the difference that political leadership can make. We know what happens when a Prime Minister does wake up every day thinking, what am I going to do today to make the country a fairer and more equal and just society? We saw this under the last Labour government. In 1999, Tony Blair promised to end child poverty within a generation, and they set ambitious targets to halve child poverty by 2010 and to eliminate child poverty by 2020. And when the last Labour government left office, we left to the Conservative-led government that followed an inheritance and a track record that put them on course to achieve that target. And 2020 will be remembered in the history books, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the year of the COVID-19 pandemic. But it should also be remembered, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the year in which this country, one of the richest in the world, ought to have achieved its target to end child poverty. I'll certainly give way to the Minister.
Make a very powerful speech. What he didn't say was whether the Blair government actually hit its target of ending child poverty within or at least halving it by 2010. Did they or not?
I'm absolutely delighted the Minister answered that question, because I'm about to lay out in full the record of the last Labour government. According to the LSE and their Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion, by the end of the period of new Labour government, both child poverty and pensioner poverty had fallen considerably, in circumstances where child poverty would have risen without the reforms and pensioner poverty would have fallen less far. In terms of absolute poverty, child poverty fell by over 2 million from 1997 to 98 to 2009 to 10, and pensioner poverty fell by almost 3 million in the same period. In terms of relative poverty, child poverty fell by 800,000 between 1997 to 98 and 2009 to 10. The number of pensioners in relative poverty fell by over 1 million in the same period. That Labour government oversaw an £18 billion annual increase in spending on social security for families with children, as well as an £11 billion rise in payments for pensioners by 2010. These rises were supported by other anti-poverty policies, including Sure Start, the national minimum wage, increased childcare support and increases in education spending, which rose from £56 billion in 96-97 to £103 billion in 2009-10, a real terms increase of 83%. The last Labour government also pretty much eradicated homelessness and made ending insecure housing a priority, reducing the number of households in priority need of housing from 135,000 in 2003-04 to just 40,000 in 2009, and also pursuing the decent home standard to boot, so that children were growing up in far better conditions than I did. That is a record to be proud of. That is a record to a government that got its priorities right. Yet when it comes to this government, Mr Deputy Speaker, it took a celebrity footballer to get them to do the right thing on something so basic as making sure that children who would have otherwise gone hungry were fed this summer. It's not just that the government doesn't have its head in the right place, it's that it doesn't have its heart in the right place either. And unfortunately, we can't rely on Marcus Rashford being on speed dial to get the Prime Minister to do the right thing on every occasion. Well, I don't think we can rely on the Chancellor to do the right thing on every occasion. That's why it's important, as we've laid out in new clause 29, that we make sure that what counts is what's measured. And with new clause 29, we ask the Chancellor to conduct a review of the impact of this bill, no doubt very soon this Act, on poverty in the United Kingdom. And just with the environmental ambitions of the government, Mr Deputy Speaker, I doubt this bill will move the dial on poverty much, if at all. The government's own Social Mobility Commission has asked that the Office for Budget Responsibility conducts an assessment of all of the fiscal statements it usually does but this time looking at child poverty and anti-poverty measures in particular. And I urge ministers to look carefully at this issue again. We raised this in the Bill Committee. We weren't successful in persuading the Minister of the case then, but I hope we can persuade him of the case now, because perhaps if Treasury ministers and officials know that the OBR will be looking at those numbers in the same way that they do the other numbers in their assessments of government fiscal events, perhaps it will concentrate the minds of people in the Treasury to get their priorities right. Next week, Mr Deputy Speaker, we know the Chancellor will be coming before the House to deliver an economic update. After the Prime Minister's statement this week, I think he needs to do a lot better than his apparent boss did when making a speech which was trailed as a New Deal. It wasn't a New Deal, Mr Deputy Speaker. Its ambitions were modest. Much of the content was re-announcement. It certainly wasn't a Green New Deal. But perhaps when the Chancellor comes forward next week, he can do the opposite of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister overpromised and underdelivered. Perhaps, given the way in which the economic update has been trailed as such, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor can underpromise and overdeliver next week. Because he has a golden opportunity in the wake of this crisis to think really seriously and substantially about the way our economy works and whose interests it serves. And I hope that when he comes forward next week, he does so with the full budget that my honourable friend the Shadow Chancellor has called for, a back-to-work budget focused on jobs, 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 a budget that can actually tackle the gross inequalities and injustices of our society, a budget that puts us back on track to eradicate child poverty within a generation and to eradicate poverty for everyone. Because for all of the challenges of the last decade, Mr Deputy Speaker, and for all of the challenges we are living through now, this remains one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It also happens to be a great country, a country full of opportunity for so many people in education, in industry, in arts, in science, in imagination and industry. But those opportunities are not available to everyone. That should be something that keeps ministers awake at night. It's something that keeps me awake at night. But I do wonder, having listened to our Prime Minister only weeks ago in this chamber, whether when it comes to tackling child poverty in our country, the Prime Minister's heart is really in it at all.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the opportunity to speak to New Clause 30. It stands in my name and that of my right honourable friend from Maidenhead and of a former aviation minister as well, and other members who understand the crucial role of the aviation sector, not only in bringing very large amounts of employment and prosperity to our own constituents, in my case representing an area immediately adjacent to Manchester Airport, the Right Honourable Lady from Maidenhead, many constituents working at Heathrow Airport, but also members who understand the wider impact of the aviation sector on the British economy, the way it drives growth and opportunity in our country. Mr Deputy Speaker, the deficiencies of air passenger duty are well known, and this is an argument that has gone on for many years. Introduced originally under the guise of being an environmental duty or tax, in fact, I think it has simply been a way of deriving revenue. It is by now the highest tax of its sort anywhere in the world. In normal times, it is a drag on the development of new routes and connections around the world, and a particular problem again for regional airports, which find it harder to establish those new, especially long-haul routes. And crucially, air passenger duty takes no account whatsoever of emissions or the environmental impact of an aircraft, a class of aircraft, or a flight. So, new clause 30 seeks to ensure that a review should be held and held quickly, to be published within 3 months by the 1st of October, of the likely effect of changes in air passenger duty rates on the aviation sector. The bill, as it stands, the finance bill, I believe only provides the capacity for ministers to increase rates of air passenger duty. But I think it's critical that we look wider than that at the possible benefits that could come from reductions or a suspension. And particularly important, of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the government's response to it. The House will know that the aviation sector, along with hospitality and leisure, is among the hardest hit sectors of all. And the effect on aviation has been exacerbated by Foreign Office guidance, which still advises against all but essential overseas travel. And in the last few weeks, also by the implementation of a blanket quarantine proposal, a policy which I hope will come to an end in the very near future with the announcement of a large list of so-called air bridges, which I think the industry is expecting might take place tomorrow. So the effect over the last few months of both the pandemic itself and of policy in relation to the pandemic has been chilling for the aviation sector. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the House is well aware of the very large number of jobs that have already been lost in the aviation sector in recent weeks and months, and I think there is little doubt it will take a long time for aviation to come back to the state of health in which it previously enjoyed. Whilst this is by way of a probing amendment, and I say to the Minister on the Treasury bench that the real purpose of it perhaps is simply to flag the importance of this issue prior to the fiscal event or the statement that will be made next week by the Chancellor. I'm sure the Minister is well aware of the principle set out by Colbert, that the art of taxation is the extraction of the maximum number of quills from the goose with the minimum amount of hissing. I think the danger at the moment is that far from being an easy source of revenue for government, passenger duty, if it remains unreformed in the coming weeks and months, risks killing the goose rather than allowing the government to extract the quills. So I hope the Chancellor will look very seriously before his statement at the case for a temporary reduction or suspension of air passenger duty in order to assist the aviation sector to get back to where it should be. But this would be an opportunity to see the wider economic benefits that could come by achieving that greater connectivity for our aviation sector, particularly for regional airports. It would also be an opportunity to look at whether an improved regime might be introduced at the end of such a period of suspension, one which seeks to reward more sustainable aviation rather than seeking simply to extract revenue for each passenger flying. And thinking, just as I come to a close, thinking of the Prime Minister's speech earlier in the week where he flagged the importance of more sustainable aviation, the government's drive to make sure that Britain develops the first long-haul carbon neutral passenger aircraft, this should be an opportunity for the government to look at a new type of air passenger duty or a new way of taxing the sector which actually rewards and encourages better performance in environmental terms, lower emissions, and therefore helps to power that investment in technological advances of that sort. So I will not be pressing New Clause 30 to a vote, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I do hope that ministers will take the case very seriously and will bring proposals forward next week in the Chancellor's statement. Thank you.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The unprecedented support that the UK Government has given to business during this crisis has been welcomed, but we feel that we need a bolder and more radical approach to ensure that recovery helps to deliver a fairer, more resilient economy with well-being at its core. Across the parties and the nations of the UK, everybody's aim in this crisis was principally to save lives. But we now face the difficult task of rebuilding our economy after the unprecedented suspension of economic activity after the last few months. There's no doubt that we will have diverging ideas of how to achieve this, but my colleagues in the Scottish Government and here in the SNP benches, we've worked as constructively as we can to produce a clear strategy for the future of Scotland's economy. And that strategy is important because it's not good enough just to lurch from crisis to crisis. I've now been here for 5 years with 2 elections in between and 3 Prime Ministers, now a pandemic and a likely no-deal exit from the EU at the end of the year. We've seen a vacuum of economic strategy from successive Conservative governments. And it's time for this government to recognise the unique circumstances we find ourselves in. We need to rebuild and to grow our economy, and we need a vision for that, for what we want that to look like. This crisis has clearly deepened existing inequalities, and we have to seize the opportunity to build a new kind of economy and one that tackles poverty and inequality at its root. Research from the New Economics Foundation has found out that only 6% of the public want a return to the pre-pandemic economy. The SNP's new Clause 10 would hold the Government to account on tackling child poverty and require the Chancellor to review the impact of the bill, because we want to ensure that the inequalities which have widened as a result of this crisis do not continue to do so, and we support Labour's new Clause 10, which complements our clause. It's unfortunately the case that we cannot trust the UK Government to deliver on tackling inequality on its own. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen the intention to return to the punitive regime of benefit sanctions, which has caused so many families misery and hardship. Now, how families are supposed to go out to work when they may be shielding, when they may have children at home, when they may put at risk their families by going out to work is really quite impossible. I don't know how the government expect people to do that, and they should definitely urgently rethink the benefit sanctions proposals. We've seen the government providing free school meals for children in England only after being shaved into a U-turn by Marcus Rashford. And we've seen a Prime Minister more concerned with a £900 million paint job on a plane than supporting families. It gives a real indication of this government's priorities. The Scottish Government is taking child poverty incredibly seriously. They've set in statute their commitment to... They're grumbling in the benches over there. If you'd like to tell me why £900 million in a plane is more important than... It's not 900,000 on a plane. If you want to tell me why 900,000 on a plane is more important than feeding children, all of it is too much. All of it is unnecessary when there are children in my constituency and constituencies around the country not having food to put on the table. Money spent on redecorating a plane is a shame that should stay in this government. The Scottish Government have taken child poverty incredibly seriously. They've set in statute the commitment to eradicate child poverty by 2030, with concrete action in the Child Poverty Delivery Plan, backed by the £50 million Tackling Child Poverty Fund. Child poverty in Scotland had fallen, but it has been on the rise since 2010, since the Conservatives took over. Research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation directly attribute this rise to welfare policy. And I would add as well that policies that are out with the control of the Scottish Government, like no recourse to public funds, cause significant poverty in people who are working. And I have constituents coming to my office who cannot put food on the table for their children, are struggling to pay their bills, have come to my office for several years in a row to apply for the Christmas Presents Fund that is run in Glasgow. Because even although they are working, they are not entitled to the benefits that their neighbours get. You could have 2 children sitting next to one another in a classroom, but because one family has no recourse to public fund, one set of children goes without. And the government must rethink this, because we've seen through the coronavirus crisis as well that people with no recourse to public funds find it far more difficult to support themselves through this time. I will, absolutely.
I'm grateful to the SNP spokesperson for giving way, and she is quite right that so much of the responsibility and the blame for what's happening in Scotland rests on the shoulders of the decisions taken here by the Conservative government in Westminster. But I cannot resist asking the honourable member, given that between 1999 and 2007, when Labour was in government in Holyrood and in Westminster, aren't the people of Scotland better served when there's a Labour government here and a Labour government there?
The honourable member seems to think that if Scotland just hangs about and waits for a Labour government, everything's going to be fine. We would rather have Scotland's powers in our own hands rather than having one hand tied behind our back in this union. So we are stuck with the policies that this government proposes, with this Parliament proposes, that the people of Scotland in many cases have not voted for and do not want. And on no recourse to public funds, it's very difficult as well to assess the impact that this has on poverty in constituencies across the UK, because I asked for a breakdown by constituency of the number of people with no recourse to public funds, and the government has said that that information could not be provided to me. So I can't tell how many people in my constituency have no recourse to public funds and are struggling. And it comes to the Scottish Government to try and fix some of these problems, because as soon as anything is proposed to get around no recourse to public funds, the UK Government shuts that down and says that it can't happen. So the Scottish Government has an anti-destitution strategy for no recourse to public funds, because the serious situation that many people are facing is something that they feel that they need to take a degree of responsibility for, because they are our people and we want to try and help them. And I would call on the UK Government that when that strategy comes forward, they do not stand in the way of trying to support people in society who need help. Academic research has shown that the single most effective policy to reduce child poverty in Scotland would be for universal credit payments to be increased. And the Scottish Governments are using the powers that we have to invest in this new Scottish child payment, which will lift 30,000 children out of poverty. But with universal credit applications more than doubling since this time last year, we badly need sustained investment in the welfare system from the UK Government, and it is disappointing that the Prime Minister has failed to rule out a return to austerity. The UK Government's welfare cuts are estimated to reduce social security spending in Scotland by up to £3.7 billion in 2020-21. The Scottish Government are spending over £100 million a year to mitigate the worst of these, including mitigating against the bedroom tax. But as Professor Alston, the UN's Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, in his report in Poverty in the UK wrote, devolved administrations have tried to mitigate the worst impacts of austerity despite experiencing significant reductions in block grant funding and constitutional limits on their ability to raise revenue. Scotland and Northern Ireland each report spending some £125 million per year to protect people from the worst impacts of austerity. And unlike the United Kingdom Government, the three devolved administrations all provide welfare funds for emergencies and hardships. But mitigation comes at a price and is not sustainable. The Scottish Government has said that it has reached the limit of what it can afford to mitigate, because every pound spent on offsetting cuts means reducing vital services. Professor Alston was absolutely right in that assessment. Mr Deputy Speaker, we cannot under any circumstances return to the austerity of the past. The welfare state and public services have been devastated over the last 10 years, leaving our economy vulnerable. It's still unfortunately the case that we don't know if or when a second wave of COVID-19 might happen, and we must use this opportunity to build resilience where possible. We can allow a more flexible labour market response by increasing the generosity of universal credit, allowing people the financial headroom to gain new skills to meet the changing demands of the economy. The Chancellor has said he will do whatever it takes to protect jobs after the recent Treasury Committee report revealed that over 1 million people have fallen through the gaps in the support schemes. It's vital at this critical stage that the Treasury strengthens and extends these schemes to ensure a strong economic recovery from the crisis. It's extremely concerning that the Government are pushing ahead with plans to wind support schemes down, particularly concerning that New Clause 19 of this bill will designate grants to help businesses, employers of individual partners of partnerships affected by the coronavirus crisis as taxable income. It's concerning also that HMRC will be given new compliance powers to enforce these rules, but that has not effectively been communicated to businesses. Any new powers granted to HMRC must be proportionate and serve to aid recovery rather than provide a further barrier for businesses to overcome. These concerns have been backed by tax experts such as CIOT, who have said it's vital that HMRC take a reasonable approach to enforcement in these cases where recipients of CSPs are not entitled to the money they received. There will be cases where people have made inadvertent errors in the claims, which may not come to light for some time. There will be cases where the person just did not know of the requirement to notify an overpayment. It is imperative that HMRC obtain a full understanding of the facts in every case and take a proportionate and targeted approach in their compliance activity in the months ahead. It's extremely important that HMRC and the government gets these details right. Many businesses are already on their knees and vulnerable to further shocks, and many businesses in my constituency are struggling to deal with HMRC, with errors in reporting systems, meaning that they are not entitled to the payments that other businesses have got, and it's very difficult to address these problems. If businesses are left to fail as support is withdrawn, then billions of pounds, which have already been spent by this government, will be money wasted. I highlight again, as I did at committee stage, the concerns raised by the Association of Business Recovery Professionals, R3, about the plans to grant preferential status to HMRC in insolvency procedures from December this year, covered by our amendments 9 to 15. They and UK Finance are concerned that this will undermine business lending and make it harder to rescue businesses out of administration. And we have seen many companies in recent weeks, many of them across the UK, struggling and going into administration. So the Treasury should consider carefully whether their plans will help businesses or hasten their demise. Countries all over the world will be facing the same choices and facing growing levels of public debt. But if we are fully to recover from this, we need to prioritise growth and well-being over deficit reduction. The Scottish Government has this week laid out a plan for a fiscal stimulus package of £80 billion to stimulate growth for the whole of the UK. This would be used to accelerate major investment in low-carbon energy efficiency and digital infrastructure and deliver a Green New Deal for the UK. The value of this investment can be recognised by assessing the Government's fiscal sustainability in terms of its public sector net worth. It's regrettable that the UK will, of course, miss out on the European Commission's €750 billion stimulus, and it makes it even more critical that the UK Government commits to its own stimulus, a proper stimulus, not the pretendy one that was announced by the Prime Minister this week, in the wake of COVID-19, such as a reduction in VAT and job guarantees for young people. And speaking of even younger people, Mr Deputy Speaker, a small plug for my small and uncontentious Amendment number 4, which only seeks to add a point of clarification to specify human breast milk as part of the VED exemption for vehicles carrying blood. It would be an important signal from this UK Government of support and recognition to those operating milk banks and to the mums donating their breast milk, which goes to help some of the most vulnerable babies in ICU units across the UK. Amongst those is the extraordinary woman who last week donated an astonishing 32 litres to the milk bank, which covers all of Scotland. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Scottish Government and my colleagues here at Westminster put a considerable amount of work into formulating a meaningful strategy for Scotland's recovery and future progress in delivering inclusive growth. I sincerely hope that these policies are taken seriously by the Treasury and that we can look back on this time as a pivotal one in making progress towards a fairer and more equitable society.
Maiden speech. Mark Jenkinson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's an honour and a privilege to be addressing you from these green benches, and most unexpected for a Wookitten lad like me. It would be fair to say that neither timing or circumstance of my maiden speech are as I imagined. My original timing has been altered by the loss of one of Wookitten's great artists, a much-loved former teacher and my wife's grandmother, followed by lockdown, and the circumstance altered by a socially distanced chamber and our new normal in the light of coronavirus. On that subject, Mr Deputy Speaker, I must pay tribute to the huge sacrifices that each and every one of my constituents has made to stop the spread of the virus, and to the huge effort from many individuals and businesses with their contributions to local community and national efforts. If I was to look for one positive in recent months, it would be the way that so many of my constituents have stood up to the plate to support those around them. The scale and speed of the government's response to coronavirus has been unprecedented. The measures we've seen across the grant schemes, rates relief schemes, furlough schemes and bounce-back loans have been welcomed by my constituents in Workington. There is more to do and there are lessons to be learned, but I'm incredibly proud to be here today to support the government in their efforts. I stand here before a house that has never before so closely resembled the makeup of the country, and particularly on this side, as so many of us now speak for industrial communities that the benches opposite deserted. As the son of a bin man and an office clerk, and as a former British Steel apprentice without a university education, I'm testament to that change. While I never thought growing up that I might grace these green benches, others seemed to. One of my secondary school science teachers, Mr Harris, once recognised in my school report, if the Prime Minister is listening, my ministerial potential. He suggested agriculture, but I'm not fussy. Not having spent a huge amount of time outside Cumbria, I wondered how I might identify fellow Cumbrians in the big city. Folklore has it that I should greet those about whom I have suspicion may be Cumbrian in my native dialect with "As the racing could have a 5-bar yat." In the hope of eliciting the answer, I would have been a Gaelish curry else a varlal yat. At the risk of destroying the ancient practice of identifying Cumbrians in exile, for those not lucky enough to hail from God's own county of Cumbria, that is dialect for, have you ever seen a donkey jump a 5-barred gate? And the response, yes, it must have been a very fit donkey or a very small gate. Alongside the promises I made to my constituents for infrastructure improvements, increases in school spending, nurses and police, and levelling up, which this bill starts to deliver and are very much welcomed across Workington, I'll take any attempt that I can to have Hansard record Cumbrian dialect for posterity. It's customary on these occasions to talk about one's predecessor, and I take the opportunity to thank Sue Hayman for the work that she'd done in this House and across the constituency. She was and remains a deciduous proponent of her causes, which I understand she may have the chance to continue from the other place. I wish her well and look forward to working with her to enhance the lives of my constituents. However, I also wish to talk about another predecessor, John Christian Kerwin, the Whig MP for Carlisle, a long time before my honourable friend representing that seat now, before he went on to win the Cumberland seat in 1826. Under Kerwin, Workington was the birthplace of modern agricultural practices at his model farm. Scouse Farm is still farmed to this day. He also introduced the first recorded social insurance scheme locally and attempted to do so nationally as an MP, nearly 100 years before Lloyd George put forward the scheme we now know as National Insurance. If I can make a fraction of the impact that Kerwin made on my constituency, it would be in a good place. But he wasn't, by his own confession, what's called a good party man. He was one of those opinionated stalwarts whose independence found readiest expression in alignment with the opposition. Having watched the drama in this place over the last few years from the outside, I hope for the sake of my honourable friend, the member for Walsall North, and for my right honourable friend, the member for Sherwood, that's one of his traits I leave in the past. It was the home of John Christian Kerwin, whose picture hangs in the corridor close to your office, Mr Deputy Speaker, that brought me into politics. The destruction and subsequent decay of Workington Hall, allowed over decades, remains a blight on Workington. I hope to use some of my time here to bring life to what remains, Grade 1 listed and partly an ancient schedule monument. But the town of Workington is just one of 5 towns in my constituency, the others being Cockermouth, a wonderful market town filled with independent traders who have truly shown their resilience in recent years. Maryport, who have accepted me so warmly into my constituency office there and sits on the cusp of revival thanks to this government's future high street investment. Aspatria, where I continue to work hard to protect their future in the face of proposed closure of the Sealy Bed Factory, and Silleth, a gem of a Victorian seaside town that I can recommend to any of the honourable members of this House. The Workington constituency is 30 miles of coastline, stretching from industrial towns to the rural villages at the end of Hadrian's Wall. There are a number of members of this House and of the other place who saw much of the constituency last year through the campaign in all weathers, and I fondly recall a video recorded by the honourable member for Hexham in the wind and rain in Westfield, as no one could hear a word coming from the mouth of a man that looked like he'd been dragged from the sea. I give thanks to all the members of this House, of the other place, to the many other friends, and to my wife and family for the support they gave me on this journey, my journey to this place, and continue to give me as I settle into these green benches. West Cumbria has led the way in many sectors over many centuries. Not only with Kerwin, Little Clifton gave us John Iron Mad Wilkinson, a protagonist of the Industrial Revolution who made his mark in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Telford. Later, Henry Bessemer chose Workington to base his company, and we went on to send the finest steel around the world. Our rail and track products still underpin many a thriving economy. Cockermouth gave us renowned astronomer Feed and Fallows, while next door in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for Copeland, Eaglesfield gave us John Dalton, a pioneer for atomic theory, and Keswick's Dr. William Brownrigg discovered platinum. Borrowdale gave us graphite, and Lily Hall in my constituency became a manufacturing centre for graphite in the nuclear supply chain. And of course, the world-beating pencils produced there today, having had a previous long history in Keswick. Today, we have various companies across the Workington constituency that produce some of the finest packaging materials in the world, used by every one of us in some way every day. The Workington constituency is home to some of the most beautiful places on earth and has a great tourism future ahead of it. But we're also proud of our industrial heritage and our world-beating manufacturing processes in use today. With our friends next door in Copeland, we're the home of the UK's nuclear expertise. We stand ready to play our part in the delivery of new nuclear and in exporting that expertise around the world. The Workington constituency also has so much more to offer, with some of the highest tidal ranges in the UK, as we talk in this place of new tidal and wave energies, as the maintenance base for the Robin Rig offshore wind farm and the constituency set to benefit from the construction of an English side extension, we also stand ready to play our part in truly becoming Britain's energy coast. Workington was a cornerstone of the Industrial Revolution. As we look to our future, I'm sure the Workington constituency will be at the core of the low-carbon energy revolution to come, and I'm delighted to be able to be here to be able to play my part, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member from Workington for his maiden speech, and I hope that he, like a newbie like me, enjoys his time in this place and is a strong voice for the people of Workington. Mr Deputy Speaker, yesterday I spoke in the Finance Bill debate about job creation. I spoke about the importance of not only creating jobs but secure jobs that put the needs of workers at the heart of the economy rather than profit. It seems rather appropriate that I have the opportunity to speak in the child poverty debate today, because as we all know, the government's shameful record on employment and workers' rights is one of the main drivers behind child poverty. To be honest, I've absolutely no faith that the government understands the issue of child poverty in any meaningful way. In the space of a month, I had the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care tell me that this government was committed to levelling up the North East. Yet I also witnessed an Equalities Minister admitting from the dispatch box that they'd not heard of the Marmot report. Essential reading when looking to tackle health inequalities. And as a popular actor said in response, it's like a vicar not having heard of the Bible. Over the last decade, Conservative governments have systematically dismantled the progress that the last Labour government made on child poverty. Currently, 4 million children are living in poverty, with 3 million of these living in a household where at least one person is at work. In addition to this, the government's own Social Mobility Commission reports that there are 600,000 more children living in relative poverty than in 2012. This commission referenced the government's welfare changes as a key cause of this, and have predicted that these changes, along with the impact of COVID-19, will only increase child poverty. While the Prime Minister might be confused as to whether the government has caused more child poverty, I am not. It's there in black and white, in those appalling figures, and quite frankly, it's an utter disgrace. In recent weeks, we've also seen the government being forced into a U-turn on free school meals after a campaign by a leading footballer, one of the people that the Health Secretary was telling to do their bit at the start of the crisis. Isn't it shameful that we have a government who have to be embarrassed into feeding hungry children? To top it all off, the government have reintroduced benefit sanctions in the midst of a global pandemic and economic disaster. Welfare support from the government will be essential during the coming recession, yet the government seems more concerned with taking support away rather than supporting people in dire financial straits. How on earth does this help child poverty? And I just wish the government were as quick to sanction Dominic Cummings or the Secretary of State for Housing as they are vulnerable people. What is clear from these decisions is that the government either fundamentally misunderstands the issue of child poverty or they simply do not care. I would ask the Minister which it is, but I suspect it's both. Unfortunately, this country now faces one of the biggest crises in living memory. There's a combined threat to public health and the economy which must be tackled together. However, the government's tendency to view poverty as an issue with individual causes and their ignorance around the issue of health inequalities shows that they are poorly equipped to deal with this problem. When confronted with the rise in child poverty by the leader of the opposition, the Prime Minister denied the extent of the issue. To bluster and deflect would be one thing, but to deny that the issue exists is deeply worrying. How can the government be trusted to tackle this issue if they refuse to confront it and deny its existence? Successive Conservative governments have made this problem worse. And that's not my opinion, it's a fact. What they must do now is admit they were wrong and change course. A starting point would be to accept the Social Mobility Commission's recommendation that the Treasury give the Office for Budget Responsibility the role of assessing the impact of the government's fiscal policies on poverty. Sadly, I fear that under this government, child poverty will continue to rise, as they simply do not recognise the problem exists or know how to solve it. And I can only hope that they prove me wrong. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady opposite from Durham. It's also a pleasure to follow my friend from Workington, my Honourable friend from Workington. I congratulate him on a truly excellent maiden speech. It was warm, it was witty, and it was thoughtful as well, and I know he's going to serve the people of Workington very well in this place. He like me, represents a red wall seat, and the Honourable gentleman opposite on the front bench spoke nostalgically, warmly about the Blair government. Under the Blair government, both his seat and mine had 10,000 Labour majorities or more, and perhaps the opposition might reflect on why they've lost faith with Labour to solve their problems. There's poverty in my constituency, there's poverty in my honourable friend's constituency, but those people put their faith in the Conservative Party to make their lives better and make their futures better. Turning to the bill and the amendments, it is clear that an ambitious and decisive response was demanded of this government by the serious economic situation that we as a nation and indeed the whole world is facing. The budget debate in which I spoke back in March already feels a very long time ago for all of us, I'm sure. And in many ways, the world has changed a great deal since the day my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, delivered his excellent first budget to this House. And so I welcome now these government amendments to this bill, which provide both relief and certainty in a number of affected areas. And I will speak a little bit more specifically about New Clause 20 later. In other ways, however, I think it's even clearer now than it was then that my right honourable friend was ahead of the curve in the response to the challenges that we face. The Treasury have been at the forefront of the national response to the coronavirus and have been a leading example to the rest of the world with their focus on protecting jobs and maintaining the capacity of our economy, whilst also looking after the most vulnerable in our society in all the measures we've been taking to respond to this virus. The extraordinary success of the coronavirus job retention schemes means we've been paying the wages of over 9 million people who would otherwise have been laid off or made redundant, and therefore protected their jobs, their livelihoods, their families through this most difficult time. The government has, in my view, risen to this challenge of protecting our economy thoughtfully, responsibly and with ambition. And in my constituency of Newcastle-under-Lyme, that's meant 10,200 jobs supported through the furlough scheme, 2,600 self-employed workers supported with grants of over £7 million, and the local borough council have also supported our local businesses by distributing over £21 million of business grants. And I have received many emails from constituents to pass on their thanks to the government from me for the grants, the furlough and all the other measures which have helped keep them afloat, keep their businesses afloat, keep their families afloat through this period. Now, as we start to leave lockdown and we reflect on the steps that are needed to recover from the economic elements of this crisis, it is important that we all remember our manifesto pledges, which we on these benches were elected on and which this bill implements. Our commitment to levelling up all parts of the country should only be strengthened as we begin to look to the future and the easing of lockdown. And in that spirit, I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement earlier this week of a new deal, putting jobs and infrastructure at the centre of the government's economic growth strategy. This only builds on our manifesto commitments to spreading opportunity across the country and unleashing the potential of the whole United Kingdom. And the £1 billion fund for school improvements will also help to ensure that our schools are well maintained and provide students with safe environments that support a high quality education. I welcome the statement earlier today from the Education Secretary about what we can expect in September. And again, just to refer to Newcastle-under-Lyme, as one of the 101 towns that was selected for a town deal, and I draw the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest as a member of the town deal board, will also welcome the additional 500,000 or more to spend on local improvement projects. This will, I hope, help to support our high street at a time it desperately needs that help. And I must at this point highlighting the ongoing concerns of owners of pubs and bars, restaurants and cafes, and all their employees, many of whom have been in contact with me over recent months. Being able to reopen this Saturday is of course an exciting moment for many, and many are looking forward to it, but they still have to adapt to the new normal, and that is a challenge that cannot be underestimated. Our local economies will continue to face worrying times and difficult decisions over the weeks and months ahead, and we must all do what we can as individuals to help support our local businesses. Shop locally, visit your markets, support your local high streets. One other specific element of these amendments is hugely welcome is New Clause 20. This is the measure that allows certain personnel to retain their protected pension rights if they're re-employed as part of the response to coronavirus. This is something I raised on the floor of this House back in March to my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, as I'd been contacted by a constituent who had come out of retirement to work as a nurse during this crisis. She was concerned that by answering the government's call for help, she would lose her pension entitlement and rights. So this new clause ensures fairness for her and others in her position, and I'm glad to see the government legislating to protect those brave individuals who stepped up to help in a moment of national crisis. In conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, this finance bill implements a budget which not only recognises the challenges of the present, but also looks to the future. It is a budget and a bill full of ambition for our country and hope for the future. Let us not forget that our national effort in defeating coronavirus presents an opportunity for us going forward in tackling this country's challenges. Instead of despondency, we must focus on creating opportunity for our country, and that is what this bill aims to do, and that's why I will be supporting it.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. You know, it was Mahatma Gandhi, a hero to many Leicester residents, who famously said that the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. And when it comes to ensuring that vulnerable children are fed and looked after, our government should actually be ashamed of themselves. According to the government's own Social Mobility Commission, 600,000 more children are now living in relative poverty than in 2012. And this is projected to increase further due to benefit changes and, of course, the coronavirus pandemic. In 2018, the number of children living in relative poverty rose by 100,000 to 4.2 million, or around 30% of all children. This appalling figure reflects the government's failure on the fundamental principle of governance to provide the most basic needs of our citizens. You know, as of February 2020, around 14 million people were in poverty in the UK. You know, the virus, Mr Deputy Speaker, may not discriminate, but our economic and social system certainly does. You know, children from African, Asian and minority ethnic families are nearly twice as likely to be in poverty than children in white British families. You know, as Leicester East is one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse places in the UK, and has high levels of both child poverty and in-work poverty, we suffer from a perfect storm which enables the virus to have its impact. Like many of our residents, I am deeply concerned about the recent increase in coronavirus cases in our city and the economic impact of the necessary lockdown extension. I am particularly worried about the impact that the pandemic will have on those Leicester children who are already living in conditions of unacceptable hardship. Over 1 in 4, 42% of children in Leicester East live in poverty. Nearly 6,000 households, around 14% in Leicester East, are in fuel poverty. As of April last year, the average weekly income for full-time employees in Leicester East was £420. This is £130 less than the East Midlands average as a whole, and £160 less than the UK average. The proportion of people claiming unemployment benefits is also higher in my constituency than it is at the regional and national level. Mr. Deputy Speaker, does this government not believe that my constituents are somehow worth less than others? It's unacceptable that they have allowed such rank regional inequality to fester. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the worst thing about these shocking figures is that they reflect our local reality before the unprecedented coronavirus pandemic. We do not yet know the full impact of the unprecedented economic disruption caused by the virus. With widespread job losses, it is certain that it will have an exacerbated hardship across Leicester and across the UK. I have been helping countless local business and employees to stay afloat and access funding despite the government's prohibitively strict guidelines. At a national level and local level, we of course see companies like British Airways take huge amounts of taxpayers' money through the job retention scheme and then fire vast swathes of their workforce whilst imposing worse terms of employment. Too many Leicester residents have started to receive threats of redundancy at a time when the protection of workers must be prioritised. With Leicester required to maintain lockdown measures, it will be necessary for economic support to be extended and expanded. For families in Leicester East, it is crucial that they have the material basis to stay safe and stay alive during the continued lockdown. The government's callousness is demonstrated, sadly, by the fact that benefit sanctions have been resumed at a time when we face unprecedented periods of economic hardship. For people forced to endure severe levels of hardship and such insecurities, it is impossible to comply at times with the government's guidance on self-isolation and social distancing. It is morally imperative and in the best public interest of everyone in our community that the basic needs of all residents are met. You know, it's the cruelty of this government over the last decade that has transformed the Department of Work and Pensions into a symbol of fear. The coronavirus pandemic has further demonstrated the need for universal welfare support that will be there to help and support people, not punish and not police them. Even before the coronavirus hit, the government had presided over a decade in which they have cut essential services for the people of Leicester East while providing tax cuts for the wealthy, in which they have allowed poverty and homelessness to rise in my constituency and across the country, and in which they have sought to sow divisions as they facilitate a transfer of wealth from the poorest to the richest. I believe, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the government must act now to prevent the further impoverishment of working people and their families during this pandemic. They must start treating the widespread poverty of our children as the national scandal that it is. This virus has demonstrated that we have a moral duty to ensure that everyone in Leicester and across the country is protected. That means that after this crisis, we can no longer live in a society defined by extreme inequality and in which it is commonplace for our children to go to bed hungry. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Good River.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the passion of my honourable friend for Leicester East, and our thoughts are with her and her constituents at this difficult time. But it's a particular pleasure, if I may say so, to follow the Honourable Member for Workington. He made us wait for his maiden contribution because of the difficult circumstances that we're in, but we're absolutely delighted that it was worth the wait, and Workington has gained an important and well-respected voice in this House. I'm speaking today in support of my friend, the Honourable Member for Altrincham and Sale, and in support of new Clause 30 to request that the Treasury review the level of air passenger duty. And I'm doing so on behalf of the 645 individual constituents from Arundel and South Downs who signed the parliamentary petition for support for the aviation industry. They work for firms like British Airways, Virgin, TUI, or they work in the extended Gatwick supply chain in West Sussex. Aviation, as we know, has taken the full force of the economic impact of the COVID-19 crisis, devastated by border closures and the calamitous drop in passenger demand. Going into this pandemic, our aviation sector was world-leading in terms of growth, jobs and competitiveness, but that is now at real risk. Research from the International Aviation Transport Association shows the UK will be the worst revenue hit country in Europe, facing a 29 billion revenue loss and with over 660,000 jobs at risk. Now, there's many aspects to this crisis which my right honourable friend cannot help with, and I shall raise those another day. But one practical thing he could do is to remove or mitigate the headwind of air passenger duty and help hard-pressed families return to the air. I know the financial sector himself does not share this affliction, but some falsely believe that air passenger duty is an environmental measure, and that is manifestly not the case. It's levied on passenger numbers, so that an inefficient, empty plane pays less than an efficient and full one. It bears no relation to how modern an aircraft is, or the fuel efficiency with which it's being flown. And it doesn't take into account the fact that to the extent it disincentivises flight, the alternative for many passengers, and this is particularly true of domestic aviation, may be a long and polluting car journey instead. Aviation, in any case, accounts for barely 2% of human-induced global emissions, and in February of this year, UK aviation committed to being net carbon zero by 2050. That's the first national net zero aviation commitment of anywhere in the world. And it's a sector on the verge of exciting and disruptive change. We're at the dawn of what they call the third era of aviation, which will bring quieter and cleaner transport to the skies. Electrification will have as profound an impact as the replacement of the piston engine by gas turbines. British businesses like Rolls-Royce are leaders in this field of providing engines to the first generation of all-electric planes that are being certified for use by the Federal Aviation Authority right now. Mr. Deputy Speaker, APD is not a large source of revenue for the Treasury. At the best of times, it was expected to account for just half of 1% of all receipts before this crisis. But with our busiest airport, Heathrow, reporting flights at just 3% of their normal levels in April, the revenue from APD this year and next will in any case be paltry. So I conclude by humbly putting the proposition to the Minister that he may never again have such an affordable opportunity to help a vital British industry, to enhance his own formidable reputation on these benches, to strengthen the union by supporting domestic flights, and to simplify the tax system, thereby accepting the amendment today.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Arundel and South Downs. I spoke in the budget that was delivered on the 11th of March, which of course for all of us seems like a lifetime ago. Such has been the impact of COVID-19 to us socially, in terms of our health, of course, but our communities and profoundly to our economy. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to speak today in the Finance Bill, although perhaps some of my comments may have been more relevant to yesterday's debate. Of course, we were told that COVID-19 would not discriminate, that all of us would be impacted equally. But as we've seen, we are witnessing yet further inequality widening by virtue of this terrible crisis. Of course, it impacts, we now know and realise, very differently according to the nature of your employment, where you live, and so on. And it reminds me really about what we were told, or what was happening from 2010 onwards, when we were told in the financial crash, that we were all in it together. But of course that was never the case. Those who had wealth, had capital, they prospered. You look at the wealth of the top 100 in this country and how it grew exponentially in this past decade, how inequality widened so considerably. And that has to be our great fear, that the mistakes of that period from 2010 onwards are going to be repeated again now. The warm words are not enough. We have to address this. We have to recognise the sacrifice and the benefit and the contributions made by everyone across our society, irrespective of what people do. It doesn't matter whether you work in finance in the city or whatever. It's not enough. We all make a contribution. We all have a part to play in our society and in our economy. In my constituency, there are just under 2,000 children living in relative poverty. I'm sure a lot of people must think it's a very wealthy, very prosperous community. But you know, that's 1 in 9 of all children. When it comes to energy poverty, 1 in 11 households live in such poverty. And we have no quality social housing being built at scale. It's something like 9 social rent council homes built since 2010, and an average of 90 social rent homes built a year for the past 5 years. This is inequality. The children of this next generation will not enjoy the same benefits that those of us who grew up in the 70s and elsewhere enjoyed. We had a right, we had an opportunity to quality housing, to an education and good job prospects. And now what we're seeing is the beginning of unemployment rocketing. I want to cover what is missing from this finance bill, given the drastic change that we have seen in the economic picture. With prosperity, we can address inequality, but it's a choice. In particular, the support we now need from the Treasury for the automotive industry, which is so important to my constituents of Warwick and Leamington, is to protect the jobs and get the Warwick and Leamington economy back on its feet. Like everywhere else, COVID-19 has had a huge impact on my constituency. But of course the effects vary. I've spoken with a wide range of businesses that have required the financial support offered by government, which has been broadly welcomed, albeit there have been some huge gaps in the support for directors of small limited companies and others. But in my area, Warwick District, which is not entirely the constituency, 16,900 people have been placed on furlough. Many of these will be in the sectors hardest hit: hospitality, retail, leisure and tourism. And many are the lowest paid workers in my constituency, will be at the start of their working life. I have great concerns about what will happen once employer contributions to the job retention scheme is phased out entirely. The claimant count in my constituency has already shot up by 129% since March to over 3,000 people, and this will only go higher as the JRS is wound down. So I urge the government to consider extending the scheme for those sectors that are being badly impacted by this virus until we can remove social distancing measures, something which the Leader of the Opposition also asked for at PMQs yesterday. Even with furloughs still in place, people in my constituency are already losing well-paid skilled jobs in our precious automotive industry. Just last month, Jaguar Land Rover announced they will be cutting 1,000 jobs, and Aston Martin announced 500 job losses themselves. But with UK sales down 97% in the past 2 months, the sector has effectively had to cease production for 3 months, and yet companies have often found that they do not qualify for government-backed loans. Demand for vehicles has understandably fallen off the cliff, and those businesses are going to need a lot of support to get back on their feet. I have therefore written, along with colleagues on the all-party parliamentary group, to the Chancellor and the Business Secretary in my role to urgently discuss a stimulus package for the sector, which I hope they will respond to soon. There is an opportunity to not only protect skilled manufacturing jobs, the kind we are desperate to attract and retain in this country, but to drive the industry towards a greener future, which I know they are desperate for government to work with them on. But we need government intervention. It is vital to manage transition, and I very much hope that next week we will hear some positive words from the Chancellor. I therefore welcome the reforms to vehicle excise duty included in the bill, as well as the £500 million for EV charging infrastructure announced at the budget. But we must be much bolder if we are to make electric vehicles and other alternative fuel vehicles a good choice for consumers in the way that this is being done in other markets. By way of example, Norway has been by the most successful country in achieving EV market penetration. The support from the government there provides reduced road tax, free municipal parking and VAT exemption. This approach makes the total cost of ownership less than for dirtier, more polluting vehicles. We need 30,000 charging points in the UK, 3 times the amount we have now, and the investment to make it happen. When the Prime Minister talks about trying to get this economy back on its feet, the term build, build, build is wrong for me. We must make, and we must invest in our infrastructure, whether it be EV charging points, our energy grids, and in terms of alternative energy sources to build a cleaner and better future. I travel by electric bike, as it happens, and I would encourage everyone to take shorter journeys using this mode of transport. But we must make it cheaper for consumers to do so as well. Those are the sorts of grants and benefits that can really help stimulate new sectors. And I would urge the government to consider doing this next week. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would urge Treasury Ministers to look again at how the government can use our taxation system to incentivise the purchase and uptake of new, cleaner ICE vehicles, and to support our automotive industry to get firing on all cylinders again, to look at the alternative fuels, the electric vehicles, the hydrogen vehicles, to think about how we can really progress that and drive that sector forward. It must have this sector at the front of its mind before any financial statement delivered next week, which is designed to protect jobs. Without urgent action, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and action at scale, we risk losing them forever.
Sarah Onley.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Before I begin,